Story 1. I opened the door, not expecting anyone. My days were usually quiet, routine, where each morning began and ended alone. I had grown accustomed to this existence, and frankly, it suited me. So when I saw a man at the threshold, I felt something like surprise, and then wariness. He stood there, dressed in a dark coat, his eyes burned out, which immediately gave away his nervousness. I didn't know who he was, or what could have brought him to this forgotten corner. People usually don't show up in places like this without a reason. I raised my eyebrows and asked, "Hello, are you Steve?" His voice was calm, but there was a certain tension that was immediately noticeable to me. Yes. May I know your name?" I tried to be polite, but my inner unease wouldn't let go. At such moments, I always felt that there could be something more behind every step than just a chance meeting. "My name is David," he said, as if that information would explain everything. He didn't take a single step forward, but I felt his gaze sliding around the house, over my things and over my walls. I opened the door a crack to invite him in, but I was in no hurry to do so. Someone coming to me like that suddenly couldn't be random. How did he find me? Why was he here? I decided that it was worth giving him a chance, because there are few such people in life. I invited him in, but it was obvious to me that this meeting was not accidental. We sat down at the table. He sat opposite me, and I saw his hands shaking slightly as he picked up his cup of tea. He didn't say a word, just looked at me, as if studying me. At first, everything was quiet. I tried to focus on his face, to understand who he was, what he was looking for. His face was familiar, but I couldn't remember where I had seen it before. Then he took out a small package. I had noticed it when he came into the house, but I hadn't paid it any attention. He carefully placed it on the table, examining me carefully, as if testing my reaction. The brown paper was slightly wrinkled, and the string that tied this something looked very worn, as if it had passed through many hands. Something about this package made me uneasy, but I couldn't figure out why. He was in no hurry. He was silent, looking at me and then at the package, as if he was considering whether to open it. I could feel the tension building, as if this was all a preparation for something important, but I wasn't sure what it was. He took a deep breath and finally began to speak, slowly without rushing, as if choosing each word. "She's gone, Stevie," he said. David's voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but there was a heavy undertone to it that I had to force myself to hear. "She's gone, and there's nothing I can do." And then I realized that this wasn't just a story. This wasn't just a man asking for help. This was a man who had lost someone, lost in the most extreme way possible. "She fell asleep in my arms and never woke up," he continued, not taking his eyes off the table. "I asked to have her fixed up, even though she wanted to be cremated. Her heart is probably in some child's hands now, or her liver in an alcoholic's." His words were not very clear, as if he did not believe what he was saying, but his eyes were full of pain. I did not know what to say. I felt him drawing out of me the emotions I had been trying to avoid for so long. Silence hung in the air, as if under a spell. I looked at the package, now unable to tear my eyes away from it. I thought I knew what was in it. In that simple box lay not just an object, but part of some tragedy. It was not just a box. It was something much heavier and more terrible. He continued, but his words were mixed with a silence that seemed too loud to be normal. There was fear in his voice. "I hope that the pieces that are left will help someone. I couldn't do anything anymore. And now I don't know what to do with this." He paused, taking a deep breath. There was more than just pain in his eyes. There was desperation and something more, an inability to let go. He was tied to his past, unable to break the bond that haunted him. I didn't know what to say. I thought I could help, but I wasn't prepared for what was happening in that room. We both sat in silence, and I felt like I should say something, offer something, but I couldn't. I didn't have the words. David was silent too, continuing to look at me, as if hoping for some miracle answer. The process he was talking about was not a normal process. He was talking about something completely different, something that didn't fit into the usual framework. He wasn't talking about death. He was talking about life, about trying to hold on to a piece of life, trying to get something back that was lost. And I didn't know if I could help him with that. I didn't know what was waiting for me ahead. Time dragged on like a viscous substance, stretching out with each moment of uncertainty. I sat across from David, trying to process everything he had said. His words were heavy as lead, and their weight was pressing down on me, but I couldn't find my place. I knew something was going to happen. It didn't matter what, but it had to be something I had experienced before, even if I hadn't fully realized it. When I looked at him, his eyes were clouded and his lips were pressed tightly together, as if he was afraid he wouldn't be able to say everything that was in his heart. He kept holding the bundle in his hands, as if he was afraid that if he let go, something would inevitably change. It wasn't just an object for him. It was the last memory of the woman he loved so much, the woman he had lost. He exhaled and shook his head, then slowly placed the package on the table, as if he were now ready to open it. His hands began to shake again, but he held back. I noticed his eyes moving around the room again, and I knew he was looking for something. Maybe it was a corner of my apartment that could give him a sense of peace. Maybe it was the air itself, which could ease the tension a little, but nothing happened. Everything remained the same. I couldn't bring myself to ask what exactly was in that package. At some point, I realized that I didn't need to know to understand what was happening. I already knew. I knew what had happened to David, and I knew that this meeting with him was not an accident. In life, such things don't just happen. What mattered was that he had come to me, that he had come for help. And I felt something more than just a desire to help begin to awaken inside me. It was something deeper, elusive, but very real. "Steve," his voice was quiet but strong, like a wave washing over a defenseless shore. I looked up to meet his gaze. He couldn't continue, but I already knew what he meant. It wasn't just regret. It was something much more powerful, an agonizing sense of loss and the inability to return to a moment when everything was good. I felt his pain, and then everything became clear. "Do you know what you want back, David?" I said, though I wasn't sure what I was saying. "Do you want back what was lost, or do you want back something in you that was left after all this?" He was silent. Only his fingers, still holding the bundle tightly, began to squeeze harder. I continued to watch him, knowing that if I took a step back now, I wouldn't be able to help. I couldn't leave him like this. He was too close. We both knew that one way or another, he wouldn't leave here empty-handed. Finally, he opened his mouth, but his words were disjointed. He was talking about the past, about how each moment was more than just a part of life. But I wasn't listening. I looked at him and suddenly I realized there was something in his eyes that I couldn't explain with words. It wasn't just pain, it was a feeling of complete loss of control, and I could see David struggling with himself. I took a deep breath and stood up from the table to look at the old dog, who seemed to have been watching us all this time without showing any reaction. She was always there, even when everything was changing, old, already gray, almost transparent with time. I stroked her head and felt her warm eyes looking at me with some kind and patient wisdom. In that moment, I realized that this bundle was not just a thing. It was more than a physical object. It was like a memory, like a piece of something that was gone and could not return. I knew that I had to help David not just get through this moment, but to understand that he could move on. I had to help him release this weight he had carried for so long. "David," I said, turning back to him, "you didn't come here just to see me. You came here because you want someone to understand what you've been through. You want someone to hear your story, because if no one does, you'll be alone. We're all alone with our pain and loss, but it's important that we can share it with someone. You're not alone, David." He slowly raised his head and looked at me. I saw his eyes fill with tears. He picked up the bundle again, but now he held it less carefully, as if he was ready to let go. And maybe he was. Time passed, and this moment became something important for both of us. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew that with each step, we were both getting closer to something that could change us forever. He stood up without saying a word and walked to the window, looking out at the rain that had begun to fall again. His hands were shaking slightly, but there was something different in his movements now. Less of a desperate struggle than an acceptance that he couldn't control everything. I stood there in the room full of difficult memories, knowing that he had a much harder road ahead of him, but perhaps it wouldn't be as dark and lonely as it had been before. David had been with me for hours, but it felt like time hadn't moved. He was silent the entire time, as if he were considering every word I'd spoken. Sometimes his eyes would go blank and then fill with pain again. He still held that bundle like it was sacred, like something he couldn't let go of. But I could see that something inside him was beginning to change. As I approached the window, I saw the rain continuing to pour down the glass, making the world outside gray and blurry. I felt the room lighten a little, as if the rain was washing away all the tension and heavy thoughts that had accumulated. We were both silent, and there was something almost comforting about that silence. But deep down, I knew that the silence couldn't last. Something had to be done. I turned to him, and our eyes met again. He was calmer now, but that calm was an illusion. I knew that beneath his outward calm, there was an inner turmoil and doubt. I didn't know if I could help him, but perhaps this conversation was the first step toward something new, toward liberation from what had been dragging him down for so long. "Do you realize you can't go back in time?" I asked carefully, sensing that these might be the last words he needed to hear, but perhaps they would be the ones that would open the door. Sometimes the most important thing to say is the truth, even if it's painful. And while I wasn't sure I was ready for this truth, I knew it would help him move on. David turned slowly toward me, and I saw his eyes finally fill with tears. He didn't try to hold them back. He just stood there, motionless, as if it took all his strength not to fall. And I stood there, unsure of how to support him any further. There were moments when words couldn't express all that needed to be said. In those moments, you could only be there. He sat down on the couch, sighing heavily. I sank into a chair too. Silence filled the room again, but this time it was different. It was complete, deep, but not oppressive. I knew he needed time to digest everything. But what would happen next? What would he choose? Steve, his voice broke. I looked at him. He fell silent again, his face twisted in pain, and I realized that his words were not just words expressing pain. They were a cry from deep inside, a cry he had been holding back for so long. He slowly untied the bundle, and I realized that he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. I didn't know what was inside, but I still felt that this moment would change a lot. He held a piece of the past in his hands, and I could only watch. When he unfolded the paper, a photograph appeared before us, old and yellowed, but so bright in its pain and beauty. It was a photograph of a young woman, so alive and happy that it was impossible to believe that she had ever disappeared. This was the woman David loved so much. He showed me this photograph, and again I felt how the space between us became even narrower. "It's her," David said, his voice quieter. "It's the one who's gone, and I don't know what to do about it. I lost her, and I don't know how to move on. I can't just forget." I looked at his face. I knew he needed this confession. He couldn't live with this burden inside him. He couldn't just shut up and hope the pain would go away. I didn't know how to help him, but I knew one thing. If he didn't give himself the right to forgiveness, if he didn't let go of this past, he would remain stuck in this moment. I extended my hand to him and he took it, squeezing my fingers lightly. It was like a gesture of trust. He didn't say a word, but I understood him. He was ready to start the journey. I could help him, and maybe this was the only way to free him from pain. We sat there in silence, and I knew that at some point I would have to explain to him that this would not be an easy path. But I also knew that if he stayed with this burden, he would not find peace. He had to learn to let go. So we sat there in silence, and the rain kept coming and coming. I knew it was just the beginning. When David told me he wanted to meet, I felt something familiar. I didn't know him, but his voice was as desperate as I had once been. Maybe that's why I decided to help. My life had been full of people looking for answers or comfort, and I had learned to recognize when a person really needed something. But when I opened the door and saw him, I knew right away that this was no ordinary case. He was tall, with a tired look and a tired gait. It seemed that this man was carrying a heavy burden inside him, and it was not connected with anything material. When he told me his name, I heard in his voice not so much a request as desperation. He was here for a reason. It was not by chance, and I could not shake the feeling that the search for him had not begun yesterday. I invited him in, as if I intuitively knew I shouldn't refuse. We sat down at the table, and I noticed how he continued to carefully hold a small box wrapped in brown paper in his lap. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew his attention was focused only on it. He held it as if this was an important and perhaps last moment when he could do something. I offered him tea. It was polite, but also to ease the tension in the air. He accepted, but he couldn't take his eyes off the package. I watched him, trying to figure out who this man was. He looked lost, like a man who had long since lost his way back. "I didn't know what to do," he finally said, and I felt his voice waver. He spoke slowly, as if each thought was difficult for him. "She died in my arms. She didn't ask for much, just a little piece. And now all I can do is try to fix what's left." He paused and looked at the package. I could have asked him what was inside, but I knew he would open it himself when he felt ready. Instead, I just listened silently, feeling his words sink into me. I knew this meeting would change something. "I promised her that I would do everything I could to stop her from suffering," he continued, "and now I have the opportunity to help her again. But I don't know if it will work. I don't know what to do next." I sighed and looked at him, trying to figure out how to help him. I didn't know what I would do in his situation, but something in his voice told me that he wasn't ready to give up. He was ready to fight, even if the chance was minimal. As he spoke, I thought about my own experience. I had once been in a similar situation, when I had lost someone important and was desperately trying to find a way to right my wrongs. But I knew that there were some things that could not be righted. Time could not be turned back. All we could do was learn to live with what had happened. "I understand, David," I said, trying to calm him down. I wanted to say something that would help, but I knew there weren't always the right words in situations like this. "I know how hard this is, but you have to remember that you can't always fix everything. We can only try to make what's left a lesson for us." He nodded silently, and I noticed how his hands tightened around the bundle. He wasn't ready to give up, and I could see it in his eyes. He couldn't give up on his goal. This was his last attempt, and he was ready to do anything to not lose it again. David looked at me, and I felt the tension in the room rise. His eyes were full of determination and fear at the same time. He was afraid that this might all be useless, but at the same time, he knew that if he didn't try, he wouldn't be able to live with it. "Do you think it's possible?" he asked me, and I noticed his voice waver a little. I didn't know what to say. I had never had anyone in my life who sought this kind of help, and I had never experienced anything like this. But I knew that sometimes in order to change something, you have to believe in the impossible. Sometimes the only way to move forward is to take a step into the unknown, despite the fear. "I can't promise you it will work, David," I answered honestly, "but I'm willing to help you if you want to try." He looked at me silently, and I saw his tension ease a little. He was willing to take a risk. Maybe that was what was important. He was willing to go through anything to try to get back what he had lost. "Thank you," he said quietly, and I realized there was more to his words than gratitude. It was an acknowledgement that he was not alone. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new, for him and for me. When David left my house, I felt the weight that had been hanging in the air begin to lift a little. But despite that, there was still a vague fear inside me, like a shadow following his every move. I still wasn't sure if this was the right decision. All these years I had been trying to keep my life within certain boundaries, and now I was being pulled into something that was beyond anything I had ever encountered. I sat at the table, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold. My head was full of thoughts about what David had just told me. He was a man who had lost everything, and now he was looking for a way to get some of it back. I couldn't help but wonder what was driving him. Was it love, guilt, or something else that he himself might not even be aware of? It was hard for me to figure out what exactly was making him fight so hard. I thought about my life, about my losses, about the people I couldn't save, about those who left despite my best efforts. I knew that you can't always fix things, but here I was, facing someone who couldn't accept that. He was willing to do anything to get her back. And maybe there was some beauty in that, even if it didn't make logical sense. Night came faster than I expected. Time seemed strangely stretched out, and I barely noticed how the day had passed. The windows of my house were dark, and perhaps if it weren't for the light in the room, it would have been hard to tell that I was still there. But I knew I needed to think, and maybe all I needed to do was just be there for him when the moment of truth came. The next day, as expected, David called again. His voice was a little more determined, but still tinged with fear. "I'll be ready. I need some more time to think it over, but I'm ready to try again," he said. I said we would be ready, and we agreed to meet. This time I felt like I was ready for what was coming next. I didn't know how it would end, but at least I knew we wouldn't stand still. The next few days were spent waiting. Sometimes I wondered what I could do for him and what I needed to know to help. As time went on, and although I still didn't know what to do, I realized that it wasn't the decision that was important, but the attempt itself. When the day of the next meeting arrived, I felt the tension return. David was at the door as soon as I opened it, his face focused, almost anxious. He didn't say a word, but I knew he was ready. I saw determination in his eyes, the kind I could call indomitable, even if I didn't know all the motives behind it. He was ready to do anything to get back what he had lost. This was his last chance. We sat down at the table again. He was holding the same package again, which I noticed seemed so important to him that he couldn't leave it alone for a minute. I didn't ask him what was inside. It didn't matter. I knew he would open it himself when he felt ready. "Are you sure you want to continue?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. But I still had to say it. This was an important moment. He nodded, and his answer was short but determined. "Yes." And then he finally opened the package. Inside was a photograph. It was the same photograph he had shown me last time, but now I saw it in a different light. It wasn't just a photograph. It was a moment of happiness. The last moment she was with him. There was sincerity in her eyes and a love that now seemed so far away. "It's her," he said. "I can't forget her, and I have to do everything to get her back." The room grew quieter. I didn't know what to say. Words couldn't express what was going on in his soul. I realized that he didn't just want the woman he loved back. He wanted the part of himself he'd lost, the part that was with her. And I knew that helping him with that wasn't easy. But I was willing to try. After all, I couldn't let him go through this loneliness if I could help it. Sometimes all you need is just to be there. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't stop halfway. And this was his path, his choice. We both knew it was impossible to get her back, but that didn't mean we couldn't try. Over the next few days, I found myself increasingly struggling to understand what was happening. David was persistent. He wouldn't let go of the idea, Even when it seemed he had no strength left, he kept coming back. And each time his gaze became more determined, despite all his doubts and fears. I could see how he was worried, how his every move became more scorched, as if he was on the verge of losing himself completely, consumed by this ideal that didn't exist. That evening, as I sat in my chair, looking at the shadows cast by the dim light from the lamp, I wondered what it all meant. I was part of this. I couldn't just brush it off. At some point, I was caught up in what David was doing. Even though I tried to keep my distance, his desire, his passion for what he had lost, overshadowed everything else. I couldn't ignore it, no matter how skeptical I was. The next day we met again. David came to me in exactly the same condition as always. He was dressed the same as before, in simple but dark clothes with a serious expression on his face, but his eyes were still full of hope and despair. "Are you ready, Ronan?" I asked, though I knew it wasn't a question I should have asked. He was ready, and all I had to do was watch him move forward. David didn't answer right away, but his gaze was directed somewhere into the void, as if he was trying to find something that had been hidden from him all this time. I saw how he was still clutching that bundle in his hands, as if it was the last remnant of what was left to him. He wouldn't let go of it, as if it was his only chance for salvation. He looked at me and nodded slowly. There was something new in his eyes. Determination or fear that he might lose even more than he already had. "I'm ready," he said finally, and there was more confidence in his voice than ever before. We sat down at the table. I didn't know what I would say or do, but I knew one thing. I was with him. As long as he was willing to go this way, I couldn't turn away. I was bound to this decision, to his choice. He placed the bundle on the table and began to carefully untie the rope. I couldn't help but notice how his hands were shaking. It wasn't just a tremor from fear. It was a tremor from what he was holding in his hands, which could either be his salvation or his final doom. When the paper was removed, he handed me the object hidden inside. It was a small box, antique but in good condition. I opened it. Inside was a photograph of him and her, standing together, smiling and so happy. This photograph had been taken before her illness took her from him, but there was something in her eyes that said she was not ready to go, that she still had something left for him. It was the same photograph he had shown me the first time. David, seeing my silence, slowly began to speak, his voice quiet and barely audible. "I can't forget her. I can't allow myself to forget. I have to be with her. I have to find a way to do it." With every word he spoke, I felt his desperation growing. He couldn't just let her go. He couldn't let himself go. He was so attached to those memories that he was willing to risk everything to get back even a piece of that happiness they had shared. I was silent, thinking about what he needed. I couldn't find the words to support him. All I could do was sit there and listen. But listening wasn't enough anymore. I knew he needed more. He needed more than just support. He was looking for answers that I couldn't give him. "I don't know what to do, David," I finally said. "I don't know how to help you. I'm not sure I can do it, but I'm willing to go with you if you decide to." He looked at me, his eyes full of gratitude and pain at the same time. "I know, I just can't do this alone anymore. I have to try. I have to do this for her." We sat there in silence until the night swallowed us up. Time seemed to stand still. In that moment, I felt how fragile our lives are, how quickly things can change, and how we all reach for something that may already be lost forever. But no matter what happened, I was there. And although I didn't know what the next step would bring, I knew it had to be taken. The next morning, I woke up feeling like something big was coming, like an invisible threat was just around the corner. I knew that today we had to take another step, something that would change everything. Even so, the anxiety that had been sitting in my chest wouldn't go away. Increasingly, I realized that I couldn't just watch from the sidelines anymore, that both David and I were plunging into something from which there would be no escape. I glanced at my watch. It was getting late, and David hadn't called. Had he decided to put it all off, or had his resolve finally given in? But I knew it was impossible. He couldn't stop. I picked up the phone, but before I could make the call, I heard his footsteps. David stood in the doorway, his face a little paler than usual, his eyes more focused. He was still wearing his usual dark coat, and it seemed to constrain him. He looked at me, and I saw his gaze cloud over for a moment. "Are you ready?" His voice was calm, but I could feel the tension in it. He had already made his decision. All that was left was to simply move forward. I didn't know how to respond. The whole situation felt strange to me, almost like I was in a fog. It wasn't my choice, but I knew I was here. My heart was beating faster, but not from excitement, more from the knowledge that there wasn't much time left. "Yes," I replied, trying to collect my thoughts. "I'm ready." We both walked out of the house in silence. The place we were heading to wasn't too far away, but the path led through the old part of the city. I often walk these streets, and they always seem quiet and calm to me. But today, everything was different. Every shadow, every sound became too loud. too insistent, as if they were watching us. As we walked, David was silent. His hands were clasped tightly, and I felt there was something certain in his gaze. He knew what he was doing, but at the same time, he couldn't help but doubt. Each step he took was determined, but I could see he was holding his breath. When we got to the place, I realized it was nothing like what I expected. It was an old, dilapidated building on the edge of town. It stood alone, hidden in the shadows of large trees, and its battered walls looked as if they had been swallowed by darkness, leaving nothing but emptiness. But for David, this place was exactly what he was looking for. We stopped at the door and he looked back at me. I saw that same fire in his eyes, the same fire he had in the beginning when he first came to me. He looked as determined as when he said he was ready. I could see his hands shaking slightly, but his face was serious. "Are you sure?" I couldn't help but ask. He nodded silently and stepped forward. I followed him and we entered. It was cold and dark inside. The smell of damp and old was in the air. I felt the walls leaning, squeezing, and our presence here only increased the tension, as if we were intruding on something that wasn't meant for us. "Are you sure you're here, Minnow?" I asked, but David didn't answer. He simply walked forward confidently and without thought, as if his every move had been planned in advance. Finally, he stopped in front of one of the doors. It was a small room, and from the way it looked, I knew we had come to the right place. Everything inside seemed abandoned. Tables, chairs, old paintings on the walls, sometimes covered with a layer of dust, and everything seemed to be shrouded in the shadows of people long gone. David walked over to one of the tables where the strange devices were. He slowly opened the box he had brought with him and placed it there. Its contents, despite the strangeness of everything that was happening, were not surprising. It was the same thing he had brought me, only now it was going to be part of what was going to happen next. We stood there in silence, and I realized that there was no turning back. We were on the edge, and there was no point in waiting. All that was left was to follow where this strange, dangerous path led us. I felt the coldness creeping into me, as if I had become part of this place, part of what we had to do. We weren't here by accident. I knew that David, like me, had stepped into this, despite everything, even if his desire was macabre, even if the consequences of that step might be dire. But it didn't matter anymore. Story 2. I am lying in this hospital room, which has become my only home in recent months. Time moves slowly here, like a clock that has long since stopped working, but I continue to watch it, waiting for a miracle that will not come. I lie there, watching the white walls, the sterile floor, the creaking doors, and the sounds that haunt me. I cannot say that this is a comfortable place, but it has become familiar, habitual, no matter how cold and lifeless it is. Here, among the smells of disinfectants and transparent sheets, I realize that at some point everything will end. My life seems to have come to its logical end. I feel like every cell in my body no longer obeys me. My arms, once strong and determined, are now lifeless sticks, incapable of even lifting a cup of water. My breathing becomes more and more intermittent, and I feel how the air in my lungs fills me with pain. Sometimes it seems that I am about to die right now, at this moment, but I am still alive, and this awareness that death is about to happen, but not now, exhausts me more than all the illnesses that torment me these days. Everything around me takes on a special, slow rhythm. My body and mind have long since separated, and now I am just an observer trying to understand what is happening. The outside world has disappeared from me, leaving only the world in my head, full of empty thoughts. However, my thoughts have also lost the sharpness they once had. Everything is still slow, sluggish, no matter how hard I try to grab hold of them. With each passing hour, my consciousness loses concentration, as if I were slipping into a deep abyss. And here it is, the feeling I always seem to have been avoiding. For the first time, I begin to think, not about the things that filled my life, not about the past I talked about so much when I still had the strength, not about the families and friends who have disappeared, leaving behind only the shadow of memories. I don't think about what I did or didn't do. I don't even think about those who might continue on their way while I disappear, die, leave this world. My thoughts are focused on one thing. What does all this mean? And at that moment, when I realized that death was near, I was not afraid. It was not relief, but rather a certain understanding that I had never encountered before. My consciousness was firmly fixed on one simple truth, which as it now seems to me was unknown to me all my life. I always believed that life was nothing more than a collection of random events, a life that alternated between meaningful periods and quiet, fleeting moments. I wasn't looking for meaning, and frankly, I didn't want to find it. It seemed stupid, even if it was natural. I didn't need anything else. I worked, earned money, supported my family, looked after my health so that I could die with minimal losses. That was life, right? Not inventing meanings, not setting high goals, but simply going with the flow, following the existing order, respecting traditions, worrying less, and doing my thing. I always thought I would die the way I lived, simply, aimlessly, quietly. I didn't seek great goals, didn't expect miracles, and here I lie, my body barely able to function anymore. Everything I once considered important has lost its meaning. With every breath I take, I realize more and more. The end is near. And then what? There will be no greatest moment of my life, no last word or epic struggle. All that will be is a gentle sigh, and then nothing. This ending will be as empty as my whole life, and that doesn't bother me. It frees me. I can't say that the thought of death comforts me. On the contrary, it frightens me, as any end frightens me. But here's what's strange. At this moment, when death becomes inevitable, when I almost realize its presence, I suddenly understand that death does not frighten me more than life. It is inevitable, like life itself. And all my attempts to avoid it were futile. No matter how much time I spent on vanity, how much energy I put into fighting its arrival, I understood that death is not the end, but only a transition. Death is not something that tears me away from this world. It will be a part of it, a part of me. And I understand something else. I have lived my entire life in fear. I was afraid not so much of death as of the fact that it might deprive me of significance. I was afraid that at the moment of disappearance, my life would simply be crossed out, like a blank page in a book. And now in my last moments, I realized that my fear was in vain, because life itself is significance. It is not something to be sought, but something that already is, has already been, and always will be. In these last moments, as my eyes grow dim and my breathing becomes shallower, I feel myself calming down. I am no longer tormented by thoughts of what was and what might have been. I have accepted my fate and my death. And in this acceptance, in this moment of peace, I feel the heaviness disappear. I don't know what will come after, but it doesn't matter anymore. I smile, because maybe I have understood something important, even if it is only the realization that I can no longer be afraid. With every breath I take, I feel more and more like my life is slipping away, leaving only silence. Silence was something I had always known, but at this moment it seemed different, frightening. It wasn't just the absence of sound, like the long hours I'd spent sitting in the old chair and pondering life. This silence was an emptiness that filled the entire room. It was so thick you could almost feel it. I lay on a snow-white bed, surrounded by the sterile cold of the hospital walls, and I felt each breath I took grow weaker, like the last step on the edge of an abyss. I had lost track of time a long time ago. At first, when I was diagnosed, I tried to keep everything under control. Fear of the unknown, fear of imminent death made me fight. But now I realized that the fight was in vain. It meant nothing. All my efforts, all those endless years of work, effort, and dreams, they were simply disappearing, like sand slipping through your fingers. It was painful to remember. Memories that had once been filled with meaning and pride now seemed insignificant, empty. What did all those years mean that I had spent building a career, searching for meaning in something material? I was a man who liked to think that he had found a purpose. But what was that really? In the end, nothing would remain, and there would be no trace. Even my own life, which had meant so much to me, would just disappear into the centuries. I myself was like dust that would scatter into the void. I thought about the people I knew, those who lived next to me, and what would happen to them. How many more people like me would immortalize their memories in old albums, photographs, and how it would all gradually be forgotten. The body ages, and the memory fades with each passing day. All this struggle, all these goals that I set for myself disappear with each breath I take. But at that moment, as my breathing became more and more rare, I realized something important. This whole process was who I was. It wasn't just life, it was existence, a being that experiences, feels, suffers, and rejoices. And it didn't matter how long I stayed alive. It didn't matter how many feats I had performed. The main thing was that I existed. I was here. The second I realized this, I felt a strange relief. Perhaps to many it would sound like pessimism, but to me it felt like freedom. Freedom from everything. There was no longer any need to struggle, to search for purpose or meaning. I was part of something vast, immeasurably vast, and this knowledge seemed to allow me to accept my mortality. My life was only important because I was a part of it. And death was not something to be afraid of. It was simply a continuation of this journey, part of this endless cycle. I looked around the room again. The white walls, the white blanket I had on. Everything was so sterile that it didn't feel like my home. Didn't feel like a place I'd ever lived. It was just a station, a place where I might end up. But suddenly in the silence, something changed. I felt it. Subtler than ordinary silence, but more tangible. It was something I couldn't explain. I don't know if it was a product of my mind or something real, but in that moment, in the silence itself, I felt something. It was as if a new layer had appeared in the room. At first it was barely noticeable, like a barely audible noise in an empty room. It wasn't a physical sensation, but something deeper, as if something had changed in the space around me. I tried to focus, but my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. They were taking me back to the past again. I remembered again how I had spent my entire life trying to control everything around me. I thought that I would live the way I was supposed to, that I would grow old happily, that I would create meaning in my life and leave a mark. But as soon as I found myself here in this room, I realized that my entire life had been just a journey along a path that ultimately led to nothing. Suddenly, I felt something touch my hand, a light, almost imperceptible contact. I wanted to look at my hand, but I couldn't seem to move anymore. Or maybe I didn't need to look. This moment was like a test. My body and mind began to slowly retreat, and what remained was just perception. The vague feeling, as if the space around me had suddenly become more alive, was all-encompassing. I didn't know what it was exactly. Maybe it was the end, the moment when life ended. Maybe it was a transition, a moment between two worlds. I felt my eyes begin to close. It wasn't painful, but rather comforting. Everything around me was becoming quiet, and each breath was my last. But still, I felt like there was still this little spark inside me, a spark of awareness. I was alive, and that was enough. At that moment, when everything in my life, all my experiences and thoughts, seemed to fall upon me, I realized that the end is not something terrible. It was a natural conclusion to everything I once knew. I couldn't understand what was happening. The silence. It was so all-encompassing that I felt like I was dissolving into it. My thoughts no longer had a form, and my body felt alien and distant. Each moment stretched out like an endless pause, and everything around me became blurry and almost unreal. I tried to remember what had brought me here, the hospital, the white walls, saying goodbye to life, knowing that time was running out. But it was as if I was looking at my life through glass, as if it were something distant and unfamiliar. There was no point in trying to remember. All the information seemed to have fallen out of my mind, leaving only an empty space where my experiences had once been. At first, I didn't know what was happening. Every movement I made felt alien, every sensation an echo of something forgotten. I realized that I didn't need anything anymore. Suddenly, it became clear to me that I was no longer connected to the world. I was freed from everything that held me back, from all the worries, goals, and fear. I was nothing, but at the same time something, as if I was part of something huge, something that defies explanation. No matter how hard I tried to grasp these thoughts, they always slipped away. I couldn't understand how or why I had ended up in this state. My mind had been tricked. It couldn't grasp details anymore. Could I think? Could I feel anything at all? I didn't know. But in this state, I felt a strange pulling force, as if someone was nearby. And this force was not physical. It was internal or external. I didn't know. Maybe it was fear or something bigger that I couldn't understand. Something that pulled me there, into some foggy distance where everything lost its shape, where everything seemed unimportant but still important. And then it hit me. I wasn't one with my body anymore. I was outside of it. Or maybe I wasn't alive at all, but something in me was still there. I tried to take one deep breath, and suddenly it felt like I could, and again, and again. I inhaled, but the air didn't fill my lungs. It passed through me as if I didn't exist in the usual sense. I felt her then, just like I had before, when I heard her quiet footsteps down the hall. But now they were much closer. I felt her presence, even though I couldn't see her. She was there. I didn't know where she came from. I didn't know what she wanted, but it was a familiar feeling, like she was always there, waiting for me to understand. Instead of being scared, I felt somehow calm. I wasn't alone. In that moment, I realized that maybe it wasn't so scary to leave everything behind. I was ready, but not ready at all. It was like something inside me was still clinging to this world. I couldn't explain what it was, but it was there. A slight tension, like a last-ditch effort. You know it will all end one way or another, I told myself, despite the lack of sound. It wasn't in the words, but rather in the feeling that spread inside me. An inexplicable calm, as if all the questions that tormented me didn't matter. All fears were gone. It was then that I felt the fog in front of me begin to dissipate. Time ceased to exist. Everything around me became blurry, but I clearly felt my presence, and something in this presence held me. Maybe it was life, which, despite its finitude, remained valuable. Maybe it was a memory that did not allow me to leave this world. At that moment, a new perspective opened up before me. How could I be afraid of what was inevitable? Why couldn't I accept the inevitable? My gaze seemed to penetrate into infinity, into the void, and I felt it filling me. The silence around me grew brighter. Not just a sound void, but something more. I was part of this void, and it was part of me. With each passing moment, I felt more and more how the body was disappearing, how reality was disappearing, and how I, nevertheless, continued to exist. And despite all this, I felt no fear. I felt no pain. I was in a world where everything I once considered important was disappearing. I realized that the end was not the end. It was simply the completion of a cycle, the completion of what I knew. Maybe I hadn't known it before, but now I was ready to let it all go. It wasn't goodbye, it was a release. There was no murky end ahead that I had expected. Instead, there was an emptiness filled with an infinity that could not be expressed in words. And perhaps it was the best thing I could ever experience. I woke up, but not quite. I felt my consciousness gradually returning, as if it was slowly returning from a distant corner. At first, there was a feeling of a slight headache, as if I had experienced a long and heavy sleep from which I could not fully awaken. It seemed to me that I was not yet fully in my body. Something inside me was displaced. I could not determine where I was and why there were no familiar sounds. No conversations, no footsteps, only absolute silence, as if the world around me had frozen. I opened my eyes, but everything in front of me was blurry. It wasn't like waking up normally. There was no light, no movement, just a dark void from which I tried to escape, not understanding what was happening. I tried to move my arms, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy and clumsy. I didn't know what to expect. The fear, despite all its strength, did not arise. It seemed to disappear, dissolved along with my last experiences. And yet I was tense, as if something was bothering me. And then I felt it again. It wasn't a feeling, more of a presence. I didn't know what it was, but it was there, close. There might have been footsteps, there might have been hands, but I couldn't see them. Just a feeling of something waking up inside me, something alive and alien. It filled the space like air fills a room, and I couldn't do anything about it. I felt it coming closer, surrounding me. I was too weak to fight it, but I didn't want to. I was like a leaf carried by the wind, powerless to change anything. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in front of me. It was dim, barely distinguishable, but still visible. I tried to move, but my efforts were useless. I tried to breathe again, but the air was not as I remembered it. It was heavy, viscous. I lacked strength. Something inside me strangely told me that I was not alone, that there was something different in me. Perhaps it was a part of me that I had never recognized. Perhaps it was a part of me that was simply waiting. The shadow seemed to move. I felt it growing, as if it were consuming me. I couldn't understand what it was. It wasn't fear. It was something more. The understanding that I was not in control. I was like a patient in some vast experiment, and the world around me was just part of the test. I felt something invisible penetrating me, and every moment seemed more alien. And yet I didn't resist. I wasn't afraid, because I knew that this was my final path, my path to liberation. I closed my eyes and tried to understand what was happening, but the world would not let me. It was elusive, like fog, and yet I felt something sharp passing through me, like a dagger cutting out the last remnants of human consciousness. I was freed, but not in the way I had imagined. It was not an easy exit, not a calm ending. It was a smooth absorption where I lost myself and found myself again in a new sense. Like the moment when I realized that death was not the end, but only a continuation. It was all part of a cycle I couldn't control, and it became clear to me that I was no longer who I had been. I could no longer lay claim to my human form. I was something else, something that experienced its existence in an unimaginable void. And that void wasn't dark, wasn't scary, it was just different. I was a part of it, and it was a part of me. My mind was clearer than ever. I was no longer tied to my body, no longer tied to the earth. I was everywhere and nowhere. Time had no meaning, and everything I knew was fading, like an old diary whose pages disappear with each new look. I realized that this was not a struggle. It was simply a journey, and it had no beginning and no end. I heard her again. She was there, but now I was ready. My journey was complete, and I had no regrets. I had no regrets. I was free, free of everything that held me back. And now I was part of something bigger, something eternal, something silent that had always been there, but that I could not understand until I was ready to face it. I can't say exactly how much time has passed since I came here. Time has become something unreliable, stretched out, like an old painting where the colors are gradually starting to fade. At that moment, I felt the world around me begin to change, as if the space was being filled with new content again. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a process, something that was hard for me to fully comprehend. I had become a part of something, but what exactly? I couldn't quite figure out. My life, which had seemed like an endless series of meaningless days, now resembled a mirage, and I no longer felt its weight. And yet, in the depths of my consciousness, there remained a strange attachment to this world, to those memories that once made me smile or cry. I wanted to remember, but the memory seemed stretched out, blurred, like an old photograph in which faces are unclear. I tried, but I could not recapture even a part of what had once been important to me. It was like an escape, like trying to hold sand in my hands, but everything I held on to was crumbling into the cracks of time. The world around me, or rather what was left of it, was filled with vague shadows that I could not clearly see. They moved as if they were alive, but there was nothing natural about their movements. They were beings without form, but as real as light and shadow. I felt that they were watching me, that they too were part of this reality. But unlike me, they did not seek an answer to the question of what was happening. I tried to figure out what to do, but the more I tried to think, the more empty my mind became. It wasn't painful, it was strange, as if I was beyond the limits of normal perception. But at the same time, I felt that I could not be completely liberated. My presence here was part of something great and inevitable. I didn't know what, but something inside me was trying to understand, to figure out this world that was so different from what I knew. The shadows around me became clearer. Their contours acquired certainty, but I continued to feel that they did not belong to this world. I saw them, but they had no sounds, no smells, no touches. All this was not material, not tangible, but all-encompassing. As time went by, I realized that I was not alone. That feeling of loneliness that had been with me all this time disappeared. I was not alone in this emptiness, in this strange space where there was no day, no night, no time at all. There were many beings around me, different and unusual, but still connected by some invisible knot. And I felt their presence permeating me, like an invisible net that encompasses everything, and me too. I tried to touch this web, but I couldn't. It was too fragile, too ephemeral to be captured. Instead, I felt it flowing through me, as if I were becoming part of it. It was a strange, unbearably viscous sensation. It didn't hurt, but I couldn't get rid of it. I was at the center of this strange world, and at the same time, I was part of it, as if my thoughts, my feelings were intertwined with its existence. With each passing moment, I felt my old beliefs, my old fears and hopes, slowly dissolving. I didn't know if I was free or if I was trapped even more. It was like a space where all my thoughts lost their power, where I ceased to be a being with will and intentions. I became what I had always been, part of this great unknown. Everything I knew lost its significance. Everything I was gone, and instead I became something else entirely. And then, at the moment when I began to realize this, I felt the shadows around me begin to change. They became clearer, almost tangible. Their shapes gradually became similar to something familiar, but I could not understand exactly what it was. I tried to concentrate, but again I could not. My thoughts were dissolving again, as if they were dissolving in this space, and I could not hold on to them. With each passing moment, I felt my understanding of this reality becoming more and more blurred. I was part of something great and inexplicable, and there was no fear or pain in it. I became just an observer, part of this world that had no boundaries in time. In this world, I was nothing, but at the same time, I was everything. Everything I knew and remembered disappeared, and I was forced to accept it. But something stopped me. In this timeless space where I was lost, there was one thought, one idea that wouldn't leave me. And maybe that was exactly what I needed to understand. I can't remember the last time I felt like I was actually in something, more than just an observer. My thoughts would fade into nothingness, but sometimes, like sparks in the dark of night, one particular thought would emerge. Thoughts that felt real, if only for a moment. They were as ephemeral as everything else, but there was something about them that made me feel unique, if only for a second. It was a strange but powerful connection with myself that I couldn't quite explain. It felt like, deep down, I wasn't just existing, I was becoming something else. Every time I tried to grasp this feeling, it disappeared. But at the same time, I knew that this was not just the delirium of the old mind. This was something important. My intuition was trying to tell me something, but I myself could not comprehend it, as if the truth was on the edge of my perception, but did not allow me to reach it. The shadows around me, which had seemed vague and meaningless before, were now more distinct. I could feel them moving, but not with physical reality. They were not movements of entities, but rather of space itself, as if it were yielding to me. They were part of something much larger than I could have imagined. I tried to focus on these shadows, trying to figure out what they were. And then, in that moment of concentration, the world around me disappeared. It was as if everything I knew simply ceased to exist. Sounds, shapes, the very air, all vanished, leaving me in pure darkness. I saw nothing, but I felt more than ever. I was like a vessel ready to be filled with something new, and that something was vast and undefined. It was then that I realized that this emptiness was not just emptiness. It was a place where time, space, and the limitations I knew of did not exist. It was a place between worlds, between existences, where there was no end and no beginning, where everything was concentrated in a single moment that stretched into infinity. It felt like I had become part of this emptiness, but it wasn't a feeling of fear or confusion. Instead, I felt liberated. Everything I had ever experienced, everything that had once seemed important, had dissolved, leaving only me and this dark void. But there was no complete silence. There were sounds in that emptiness, but they were not sounds that could be heard with the ears. There was some kind of internal, almost inexplicable rhythm, a pulsation, as if the space were alive, and its breath filled everything around. I tried to listen to this rhythm, not to understand it, but rather to become part of it, to feel it as part of something much greater than myself. I seemed to feel the place beginning to fill with energy, the air around me growing thicker, as if it were filling with a presence. I couldn't see anything, but the place was alive. It was complete, even if it contained nothing. And then I felt something that stopped me in my tracks. In that emptiness, an idea emerged. It wasn't just a thought, it was a response that came from the emptiness itself. I couldn't explain how it came, but I knew it was something I needed to understand. I wasn't alone. I wasn't just an observer. I was part of this world, part of its creation. In that moment, I realized that I had always been part of something greater. No matter how much I tried to deny everything I knew and experienced, I was connected to this space, to this eternal moment, to this emptiness. You know, maybe the strangest thing was that in that emptiness, there was no pity. There were no regrets about the years gone by, about lost opportunities or mistakes. This was not a place for regrets. This was a place for acceptance, a place where I could understand who I was, not just as a person, not just as an old man, but as something much more. I felt this awareness spreading through me, as if my boundaries were dissolving in this place. I was not limited by time or space. I was part of this dark, vast void, but at the same time, I felt connected to everything else. It was as if I had become part of everything that had ever existed and that would ever exist. Everything I knew no longer mattered. There was no more pain, no more loss, no more goals, no more desires. I was simply, and in that simple, lay the greatest truth. I became part of this space, and maybe that was all I needed to understand. I no longer knew how much time had passed. This sense of eternity that enveloped me, as if time had ceased to exist, ceased to be something that could be measured. It spread around me like a fog, devoid of any support, and I became part of this ignorance. At some point, I stopped asking myself questions about what was happening, about where I was, or even about who I was. I simply was, without awareness of myself, without the need for this awareness. This state was strange, a kind of complete dissolution into emptiness, but not in the sense of complete disappearance, rather as if I had become a part of it. I was not alone, but I was not with anyone either. It was not a loner, not solitude, but rather a state of what was always around, and I simply dissolved into it. But it was precisely in this dissolution that I felt a certain awareness, an awareness that does not require explanation, an awareness that exists on its own. And yet, even in this state of absolute emptiness, I felt something appear in this vast space, a presence. It was not immediately obvious, but it appeared as a barely noticeable movement, a barely perceptible whisper in the very center of this dark emptiness. This presence was not something hostile. On the contrary, it was strange and alien, but not frightening. It was quiet, unnoticeable, but still perceptible. I couldn't figure out what it was, but it didn't escape me. It seemed to be coming toward me, not moving, but rather filling the space, as if its presence filled this emptiness, giving it a form that had no beginning or end. It wasn't something physical, but it was there, in this space. And that's when I realized it wasn't just a whisper or a presence, but something much more important. It was like some kind of knowledge hidden in the shadows that I'd always known but never understood. In that moment, the void I was in was no longer just a void. It became something alive, a miracle. Magic. And then it was as if the sky above me had opened up, as if the universe itself had decided to reveal to me what had remained hidden. I realized that in this emptiness, there was everything. In this space was all history, all experience, all pain, all joy, everything that had ever existed. I became part of this vast memory, and in that moment, I realized that I was not just an observer. I was part of this endless process. I was in my own time, which was both eternal and fleeting. I became an element of this great flow, this eternal moving wheel. There in that space, I understood that a person is not just a body, not just thoughts, not just emotions. A person is something more. He is a part of this whole endless story. He is a particle that is in the very center of this wheel, this small but important element that moves, changes, and exists only in its movement. And this movement has meaning. The meaning was not the goal, not the result. The meaning was existence itself, life itself, the very possibility of being part of something that is impossible to fully understand, but which is felt in the very heart. To be alive, to be in this process, that was the meaning. There is nothing more important than being here, to be part of this process, to be in one's place in this vast world. I felt a wonderful sense of completion arise within me, not in the sense that everything is finished, but rather that I finally understood that everything has a path, a purpose, a meaning. It doesn't matter whether we realize it or not. It just is. It always has been, and it always will be. Everything I have ever experienced has been part of this path, and I have been part of it all. We are all part of one great process, one great movement, and that was what I had always been looking for. As all this awareness filled me, I felt the sky, this space becoming soft. It was no longer cold, empty, and endless. It became warm, soft, alive. I did not know how long I remained in this state, but suddenly I felt that something new was coming. Slowly, the emptiness began to recede. In its place came silence, but not the empty silence in which there is nothing. It was a silence filled with expectation, filled with all that had been and all that would be. In this silence, I felt my world appearing again, the world I knew, but which now seemed new, complete, and meaningful. And it was at that moment, when I felt my boundaries, my form, my I again, that I realized that my task was not to look for meaning somewhere beyond. The meaning was to be part of this process, part of this world, part of myself. When it was all over, I smiled. Story 3. The first drop, as promised, was the beginning of something that would change everything. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it would be unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't a pill or a powder or a smoke, but something far more dangerous. Drip, a liquid delivered directly into the eye, promised more than just hallucinations. It promised to tear you out of reality and transport you to a world you'd never even suspected. A world where everything would be distorted, where space and time would dance to different laws, and you would become part of this new fabric of the universe. I didn't have to think twice to agree. There was something magical about it. Not just a desire to experience something new, but a need, a yearning to find that final frontier that could make my life more real, more fulfilling. I've always been on the lookout for something that could really shake me up, make me feel life to the fullest. This was a chance I couldn't pass up, not for others, but for myself. Dylan, my friend, offered me the bottle. His eyes were full of excitement and anxiety at the same time, as if he himself were on the verge of some great discovery or fall. The bottle was small, with a dropper, and seemed almost ethereal in his hands. The water in it was clear, colorless, but for some reason I felt that this liquid was not just ordinary water. It was magnetic. He handed me the bottle with a solemn smile, his voice calm, but I could feel his breathing quicken as he said, "One drop, man, one, and you'll see it all. Don't be a coward." I didn't think twice. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt like I was finally where I needed to be. I was ready. I took the bottle, leaned over, and carefully applied a drop to my left eye. At that moment, time slowed down, and the air became thicker. There was a momentary discomfort in my eyes, as if the pupil was stretching itself, and then everything became shaky, like water, as if I was seeing the world through distorted glass. At first, it was barely noticeable. The space around me began to pulse slightly, but it was so soft, so quiet, that I didn't even immediately understand what was happening. My hands began to tremble slightly, and I felt a strange energy filling my body. It was not something external, not air, not light. It was some kind of flow that penetrated me from within. My heart began to beat faster, and my skin began to feel everything as never before. I began to realize that this sensation was something like destruction, but at the same time, birth. I felt how something new was beginning to make its way inside me. Then the space began to change. I saw how the colors began to disappear from their familiar forms, how they became more than just visual cues. I could feel how each hue became alive. The deep blue became sadness, the bright red was anger, and even the green, bright and clear, filled me with laughter. But this laughter was something strange. It was not a source of joy. It was more of a release, as if I could finally understand something hidden behind the colors themselves. This was not just a hallucination, it was something more. I tried to understand what was happening, but every time I thought I had a grasp, the world shifted, slipped away. It wasn't something you could just grasp. It was a sense of reality that was cracking at the seams, and I could feel it starting to break. Reality began to turn into something else. I began to perceive space as alive, as if it were not something static. It pulsed, moved, like some kind of fabric that was about to unravel and tighten into strange patterns. I tried to control myself, but my body did not obey. My thoughts became fragmented. There was no time, no logic. There was only a stream that seemed to carry me somewhere I could not follow. I looked back. Dylan was standing there in the doorway. But it wasn't really Dylan. His face wasn't clear. It was pulsing, flowing like water, distorting into a shapeless mass. His eyes were empty, like black vortexes, and they were sucking up the light. I felt his presence become unbearably heavy. He was looking at me, and there was something in his gaze that I couldn't explain. He didn't speak, but I heard his voice anyway. And here, at this moment, it became clear to me, this was not just the effects of the drug. I was on the brink of something much more terrible. My perception of the universe began to break, and I did not know how much longer these illusions held me. I realized that I might not be who I seemed. I could be part of this game, part of an alien reality that was lifting me up and throwing me down. I didn't know how long I had been standing in this space, full of strange and formless sensations. Time had become so relative that I couldn't tell how many minutes or hours had passed. Everything in the world could be distorted, and this filled me with anxiety. Anxiety for myself and for what I could lose. When I tried to return to reality, I was torn from this flow. Everything disappeared. The world dissolved into emptiness, and when I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in my world. I found myself in a forest where the air was saturated with fog, and the trees stretched upward like giants, hiding their peaks in the clouds. The ground under my feet pulsated like a living being. I felt how it radiated energy. Every movement of my body was a response to this invisible force. I tried to figure out where I was, but it was impossible. Time had lost all meaning. There was no past, no future, only the present, which stretched on forever. I felt my consciousness expanding, taking in more and more information that made no sense, but was true at the same time. I knew it was something important, but I couldn't figure out what it was. The world before me was so strange that I couldn't decide if it was real or a figment of my mind. And when I tried to find answers again, when I looked up at the empty sky, it suddenly split and I saw an eye. A huge, all-powerful eye that looked at me as if it knew my every thought and feeling. It was too much for my mind. The eye blinked and the world disappeared. I was back in my apartment, the same world, but it was no longer the same. When I opened my eyes, everything was the same. It seemed like nothing had changed, but I knew it had. The world was the same, but something inside me had changed. I felt different than before. An unbearable feeling of anxiety was gripping me. I didn't know how to explain it. I just knew that I was no longer the same person. I had just experienced something that had changed my reality. But what was it? I rose from the bed feeling my legs for the first time in my life heavy, as if they were filled with something foreign, pulling me down. There was still a haze in my vision, as if I had just woken up from a long sleep, but I was not alone. Everything around me felt strange, as if I was in a world I had once known, but now it was different, as if its structure had been reshaped and disfigured. I felt as if something was watching me. It was as if in every crack, in every corner of the room, someone was lurking and watching, ready to grab me at any moment. I walked to the window, pulled back the curtains and looked out. The world outside looked the same as always, except that the trees outside weren't just trees anymore. I saw them as something alive, something more conscious than just plants. They weren't just standing there. They seemed to be feeling something. I could see their roots reaching deep into the earth, and those roots seemed to be connected to something much larger. I felt the earth pulsating, as if it were a living thing. My gaze was drawn to the clouds. They weren't moving as usual, not floating across the sky in their endless, dancing carelessness. These clouds were thick, dark, almost black, and they weren't just hanging in the air. They seemed to be rising, trying to rise up, down, breaking the rules that I had come to accept as law. I suddenly felt time shrinking, as if it had stopped flowing smoothly and was beginning to wobble, to shrink and expand, like an old clock wheel that for some reason had decided to fall off its axis. I looked around my room. Everything seemed in place. My things were in their usual places, but the feeling that something had changed didn't leave me. I felt like I was becoming part of something bigger, something that was far beyond this room, this apartment, this city. I didn't know how to explain this feeling. It was as if I had found myself in a world where everything was the same, but at the same time, completely different. I went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror. My reflection looked familiar. but it was not my own. My eyes were not what they used to be. They did not have that usual sparkle of life that I always saw. They were dark, empty, as if something had gone, something important and invisible that left only emptiness behind. I looked at my face, but it seemed alien to me, and I did not know who I was now. Alienation was reflected in every look I gave. I felt panic rising inside me, as if I was trying to find some way out, but there was none. My mind was trying to figure out what was happening, but something inside me kept rejecting any attempts at logic. What was I seeing? This was not just a hallucination. This was something deeper, more terrible than I could have imagined. I didn't know how much time had passed, but everything around me seemed to fade. My room seemed empty and hollow. I turned around and saw him. He wasn't a man, although the figure standing in the doorway resembled one on the outside. But it couldn't be a man. He was different. His face was dark, too dark to be perceived as a normal human face. It was like a black void, something that burned out the light around it. I froze, unable to move. He stood there motionless, and I felt his gaze penetrate me, as if he were part of my soul, part of my thoughts. I tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I felt his gaze begin to control me, as if I were just a puppet and he was the invisible hand holding the strings. That moment lasted forever. It seemed like it wasn't just a look. It was some kind of testing look, a look that pierced me through and through. And in that moment, I understood. I found myself in a world where there were no rules anymore. I wasn't just a witness to that world. I became part of it, part of something much more terrible than I could have imagined. I took a step back, but it didn't help. I felt my body growing heavy, as if it was beginning to swallow up the space around me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but every movement became more and more difficult. I felt the space around me thickening, as if the world was chewing on itself, as if everything around me was trying to become something more solid, and I was part of that process, part of a reality that was disappearing. When I looked out the window again, the world outside the glass was gone. Everything was gone. I found myself in a dark void where there was nothing but me and that strange, empty gaze. I woke up. Not that I could say I woke up, because the concept of being asleep or awake had lost all meaning now. I was there, but at the same time, I was not. I felt like some kind of ghost, stuck in an in-between state between worlds. There was a dark void around me, where there was no light, no shadow, only emptiness that seemed to swallow everything. I stood there motionless, not knowing what to do. My head was still ringing from the drop I had taken, and it felt like a scar cutting through me. There was no physical pain, but there was an inner discomfort, as if my thoughts were stuck in one place and could not move further. Every movement, every look seemed unnatural, as if I had lost touch with myself. I did not know how long this had been going on, but time no longer mattered here. I had become a part of this space, as if I were inscribed in it forever. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in front of me. It was not a creature, not a person, but a figure that I could not fully comprehend. It was translucent, as if it were made of smoke or fog that moved without leaving a trace. I could not tell whether I was frightened or surprised. This creature, or something like it, seemed to know me. I felt that it was watching me, that it was studying my every thought. It was strange and unsettling. I stood there frozen, not knowing what to do. The shadow moved towards me, and although I could not see its face, I knew it was coming. It was as if it was beckoning me, drawing me into a void from which I could not escape. I felt my chest tighten. My breathing became heavier. This invisible gaze that pierced me seemed to penetrate right into my thoughts, into my soul. "Are you afraid?" The question was not loud, but the echo of its words reverberated inside me. And it didn't matter who asked this question. I knew that it came from the emptiness itself, from this space. The answer was obvious, and at the same time it didn't matter. I was scared. It wasn't just a feeling of fear. It was something more. It was the realization that I was in another world, where there were no familiar laws, where everything was subject to distorted perception, where I became part of something much bigger than just one person. I tried to move, but nothing worked. All I could do was stand there, feeling the space around me begin to shrink, turning into something denser and heavier. My thoughts began to blur, and I felt like I was losing control of myself. At some point, I began to doubt whether I really still existed, or whether I had become part of this space, part of something that had previously existed only in my imagination. The shadow came so close that I felt its presence physically, a cold air that passed through me like invisible fingers, squeezing my body. I looked down and saw that my hand had become transparent, as if it no longer existed. The rest of my body followed suit. I realized that if I continued to stand here, I myself would dissolve like smoke, disappear into the void. I felt it right inside me. Everything I knew about my body, about my life, began to dissolve. Suddenly I heard a whisper. It wasn't just a word. It was a feeling that penetrated me like an invisible impulse. Look, it sounded quietly in my mind, and I felt everything around me change. Some outlines began to appear around me, vague images that immediately blurred and disappeared. I tried to understand what it was, but there was only emptiness in my head. I didn't know what was happening. All attempts to break this cycle, to understand what was happening, only led to more confusion. My head was full of chaos, as if I was caught in a whirlwind of thoughts that I could not control. I felt like the world I was in had no solid foundation. Everything was becoming shaky and formless. I tried to scream, but again I could not. My voice was lost, as if I had found myself in another dimension where neither sound nor form existed. I was in absolute emptiness. And suddenly, like a flash, I understood. I was not here by chance. Everything that was happening was part of something bigger. I was not just an observer. I had become part of this world, part of my own illusion. Everything I saw, everything that happened, was created by my thoughts. It was the result of my own thirst for knowledge, my need to go beyond reality. I created this world, and I was part of it. Now I stood on the threshold of realization, but what did that mean? I understood that reality, as I knew it, no longer existed. I was no longer part of this world, not who I had been before. I was something greater than human perception could comprehend. This was a new stage, a new reality, and I was ready to accept it, whatever it was. I tried to find support, something familiar in this world to return to myself, but everything was empty, like an endless space where neither stars nor planets could give me a sense of attachment. Everything I knew was gone, and now I was just a part of this dark substance, this silent space that silently swallowed everything that had ever existed. Every movement was an effort, and the thought, like a small spark, was lost in the vastness around me. I felt something changing inside, as if I were falling apart. It was not a physical destruction, but rather an internal process in which everything I knew about myself became blurred and difficult to perceive. My body, my feelings, my mind, all of it became something shaky, something I could not hold on to. I felt this space begin to squeeze me. It wasn't directly threatening, but it was palpable in its presence, like the pressure that increases when you're underwater. It was as if I was trapped, not in a physical sense, but in a psychological sense. Fear, anxiety, despair, all these feelings became more pronounced, as if they were living in this empty space and were now taking shape. It became hard for me to breathe. The air, if you could call it that, seemed to squeeze my chest. I tried to take a deep breath, but I couldn't. This world was alien to life. Its laws were not the same as those I was used to. Everything around me was becoming less tangible, and I understood that if I didn't start acting, everything would disappear completely. I was on the verge of loss, but I didn't know what exactly I was losing. Then in that strange, empty space, a figure appeared. It did not appear all at once, but seemed to emerge gradually, like a manifestation in the darkness. It was a man, or at least a figure that I perceived as a man. It stood at a distance, its outlines as vague as smoke, but I knew it was not a mere figment of my imagination. It was an entity that existed there, like me, but was something other than anything I could perceive. She didn't move, and though her form was indistinct, I felt her presence so strongly that it was almost tangible. I wanted to ask her who she was, but the words wouldn't leave my throat. This was not a world for words. There was no room for human communication. Instead of words, like an impulse in my brain, I felt the question, "Why are you here?" I didn't know the answer. I didn't know what to do in this place where I had been brought. My attempts to understand what was happening were becoming increasingly fruitless. I felt a viscous emptiness swallowing me up, my consciousness beginning to dissolve in this strange existence. "Are you looking for a way out?" The question came again, but not in the way I expected. It was not words, but rather a feeling. The answer was my own awareness. I was indeed looking for a way out. I wanted to return to reality, to what I knew I was. But I realized that here, in this place, there was no way out. There were only questions, there were only sensations that pushed me to move deeper into this space, to try to understand what it meant and what I should take away from it. I began to realize that I was part of this world, part of this experience. And in this process of self-discovery, I had to overcome my fear and understand that you don't always need to look for an answer. Sometimes you just need to be. Suddenly, everything around me began to move. The space seemed to come alive, as if I were immersed in a whirlpool. I lost the sense of gender, landmarks, and time. The world around me became changeable, like a liquid, and every shape, every element became unstable, as if they could change at any moment. There was something fascinating in this flow, something that seemed to pull me along with it. I tried to hold on, but the ever-increasing veil of emptiness was swallowing me up, and I couldn't understand where I was or what was about to happen. I felt my body dissolving in this flow, Everything around me was disappearing, and all that was left was a sense of timelessness. At some point, I realized that I had become part of this flow, and that this was my way out. Not in a physical sense, but in a metaphysical one. I was no longer a spectator, no longer just a being looking for answers. I had become part of something that defies explanation. And then the world around me lost all its outlines, and I myself dissolved into this boundless emptiness. Silence, it was everywhere. It was not the usual silence filled with a slight noise or the sounds of distant objects. It was absolute silence. I could not hear my own breathing, nor the noise of thoughts. Everything was so quiet that I felt an unbearable pressure begin to grow inside me. The feeling that all sounds had disappeared from my world, that I had become part of this deaf emptiness, began to press on my consciousness. In the place where I found myself, there was neither time nor space, only the emptiness itself, absorbing everything that had ever existed. I tried to move, tried to do anything to break out of this state, but my movements were strange, unnatural. It was as if I were in some kind of stagnant swamp, where every attempt to take a step only deepened my position. I could not feel my body. It was as if it did not exist, as if it had become a part of this nothing. This sensation was frightening, because I did not know what movement was in this place. I did not know what life or death was. In this space, there was neither. Suddenly, somewhere in the distance, I felt a presence. It wasn't a being, not a figure, not even a sound. It was a sensation I couldn't put into words, as if someone was looking at me. At first, I thought it was just another illusory perception that this strange silence had created. But something about this presence felt so real that I couldn't ignore it. I froze, listening tensely to the air. It was still empty, but now I began to sense movement, something that slid in the darkness, not allowing me to relax. It was as if I was being watched, but I could do nothing about it. The presence began to approach. I couldn't explain exactly how I knew it, but it was unimaginably clear that it was moving toward me. And the closer it got, the more I felt a strange mixture of horror and curiosity. What was it? Why did I feel it coming? I tried to forget for a moment what was happening and try to imagine something familiar, to somehow cling to reality, but it was useless. And there it was, not a creature, but rather something that was both familiar and unfamiliar. It was like a confluence of many images that had taken shape at some point. I couldn't quite make out what it was. It had no face, no body, just a misty, shifting figure that felt like a storm about to explode. And I was part of it. I was at the center of it all. I felt this unknown entity touch me, as if the touch was not physical, but mental, as if its presence had become part of my thought. And so, in that moment, I realized that I had found myself in a space where thoughts and entities could interact with each other, where time had no meaning and reality became purely personal. It was a strange realization. I was not here by chance. This place had not chosen me by chance. Something inside me started to give signals of fear, but I couldn't figure out where they were coming from. It felt like I was standing on the edge of some abyss, ready to fall in, but with no way to get back. This fear wasn't physical. It was something deeper, like the fear of not being able to recognize yourself after this experience. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. Everything around me was becoming more and more blurry, as if reality was dissolving and I was barely holding on to the surface. Every glance I took was like a smear blurring the picture. I felt myself losing my essence, as if it was turning into this mist I saw before me. And this essence, this unknown form, kept moving toward me, as if all this was just a premonition of what was to come. Then the thought occurred to me that perhaps I was no longer alive, that this was not a place that could be understood through familiar senses. It was a world created not for people, but for something else that I could not comprehend. And then I realized that if I could not adapt to this, if I could not understand what was happening, then I would disappear. Not physically, but as a consciousness, as a person who had lost touch with himself and the world around him. I felt the fog around me again, and this time it was heavy, pressing, like an invisible hand squeezing my soul. I stood in this world, no longer being myself, and there was a question I asked myself, but to which I could find no answer. Should I be here? Could I be something other than what I was before? The world was disappearing around me, but there was something liberating about what was happening. As everything around me began to dissolve and the space around me began to disappear, I felt as if I was falling into an abyss. At first it was unbearable, as if I was losing the very essence of myself, but gradually I began to realize that perhaps this was the way out. A way out of the familiar world, a way out of what I knew, a way out of the reality that had always kept me within its boundaries. At first it was simple. I saw only fog, and it was difficult to determine what was happening, but gradually I began to discern shapes, although they were not clear. It was like dreams, where images appear and disappear, and each next moment was different. I could not hold on to anything specific because everything was permeated with this strange, shifting feeling that reality is constantly changing, and you yourself are becoming part of it. My body, or what I perceived as my body, was also different. It didn't feel material. It was part of this world, part of the energy that was rushing through this new space. I felt my essence dissolving in this vast ocean. I wasn't myself, but I wasn't anyone else either. I was something bigger and smaller at the same time. It was as if all my sensations had become part of something vast that had no boundaries. Everything around me was not physically real. It was a world of emotions, thought forms, and energy. I could feel how emotions, joy, sadness, anger, love, began to intertwine, becoming a single stream. It was not just a feeling. It was like a merging of everything that had ever existed in my mind with what was outside of me. I felt how this stream took me, how I myself became a part of it, dissolving in this sea. I could not tell what was real and what was an illusion, and all this felt like truth, like something that had always been, but I was only now beginning to understand it. Every thought, every image that popped into my head now had incredible power. I saw how these images began to form into something greater, more complex. The brain was no longer just an organ of perception. It became something like a kaleidoscope in which everything I knew and what I was just beginning to realize were mixed. I saw a world not limited by my senses, not limited by logic and laws. It was something greater than I could have imagined. I tried to hold on to my consciousness, to hold on to my identity, but the more I tried, the more I felt it slipping away from me. I was no longer Jackson. I was no one. I was simply part of this world, part of an energy and space that was vast and all-consuming. There were moments when I tried to come back to myself, but they were so fleeting that I could barely hold on to them. Everything was so elusive that I didn't know what was happening to my mind, didn't know who I was anymore. Suddenly, I realized that time did not exist in this world. It was scary and fascinating at the same time. I was like a grain of sand in a vast ocean, but this ocean was not just vast, it was alive. It was pulsating, changing, as if every moment was new. I did not know what would happen in a second, but I knew that everything around me was connected. I felt how my thoughts, my experiences, my fears and joys became part of this huge flow, and each of them left its mark on this world. I didn't know how much time had passed since I had arrived here. There was no time here, and this realization consumed me. I could no longer perceive the world as before. Everything around me was now part of me, part of this new state I was experiencing. I tried to find some kind of foothold, but I couldn't. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I was here, and I didn't know if I would ever return. I began to feel something else. It wasn't pain, but it was a strange sense of loss. Loss of myself, loss of what I knew, loss of what I thought was reality. I began to realize that this strange illusion I found myself in was not just a mind trick. It was something much bigger, something that defied description. I felt like the world itself was not just space and time, but something alive, something that had no form, but existed in every moment, in every breath. I began to feel a sense of loss wash over me. It wasn't pain, but it was something that couldn't be put into words. It was like everything I knew was gone, like I was standing on the edge of nothingness, looking into it, and knowing that if I took a step, I couldn't go back. It was a feeling that I couldn't go back to the old world, that I couldn't be who I was anymore. And that feeling was both terrifying and liberating. As I tried to take a step forward, I felt the space around me begin to move. I was no longer just an observer. I had become part of this world. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I had changed. Everything around me had become part of my experience. With every step, with every glance, I felt the world opening up before me, as if I were witnessing something unknown and at the same time familiar. And in this state, I realized there is no turning back. I began to feel everything around me losing its shape. At first, it was subtle, just a hazy mist that seemed part of a normal dream. But with each passing moment, it became stranger. I couldn't say what it was, but the feeling was clear, as if the world was changing and I was changing with it. I didn't know what was happening, but the feeling of losing control began to grow. My vision became blurry, as if I were seeing the world through a veil. Everything that had once seemed familiar and constant was now in flux, as if space and time themselves were being distorted. I tried to gather my thoughts, to piece together the pieces of what was happening, but they blurred like clouds in the night sky, defying capture. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or even who I was. I didn't feel human anymore. I was something more and less at the same time. Just a part of it, something vague and intangible. I tried to focus on my breathing, to try to bring myself back to this world, but that didn't work either. My air was lighter, not as dense as it was in ordinary reality. Inhaling, exhaling, they weren't just a process of life, but something that slid through me without the force I knew. I felt the life leaving my body, but not in the way I would have imagined it leaving. It wasn't about physical death, but rather about losing my identity, and that loss itself was becoming part of me. I began to sense space, but not as before. Previously, I could distinguish horizon lines, figures, contours of objects, but now they were smoothed out, like water that had no boundaries. I felt how my thoughts smoothly connected with this space, dissolved in it. Everything I knew became part of something whole, and I did not know where this whole began and where I ended. I was not a separate person, but one cell in this endless and unknown ocean. With each step, this feeling became stronger. I knew that if I took another step, I would not be able to return, but I could not stop. Every movement, every change in space was inevitable. I could no longer control my actions. I was only an observer of this strange process that was happening to my essence. And the more I tried to resist, the more I felt myself dissolving. I soon realized that I could no longer distinguish between what had happened before and what was happening now. My memory, like my perception, became shaky, as if I were being erased from existence. What I knew about myself became foggy, blurry. I was ceasing to be someone. I was not myself, not who I had been until that moment. Everything I had ever known about the world, about myself, about my place in it, was now becoming empty. It wasn't an unpleasant feeling, like I was losing my identity, but rather a liberation. I no longer felt anxious or afraid. I had become part of something I couldn't understand, but which I felt deep in my soul. And in that state, when I had finally lost all form, I realized it didn't matter who I was before. It no longer mattered. I had become what I was meant to be. The world around me continued to mutate, to morph into new forms. I watched as space stretched, expanded, but now I was no longer trying to understand it. I had become part of it. I was not a person, not a creature, not anything in particular. I was part of a whole, part of an entity that had no name, and it was both terrifying and beautiful, because I was no longer alone. I was part of something bigger, and there was power in that. But when I tried to return my gaze to the reality I had left, I realized that I could no longer find it. I was in another place, another time, another space, and these places were no longer connected to the world I had once lived in. It was another order of things in which I was lost, but in which I felt as important as everything else around me. I didn't know how long it would last, but it didn't matter anymore. In this altered state, I became part of something eternal. Story 4. I stood on the edge of a cliff, looking out over the Pacific Ocean, which was blazing in the fiery reflections of the sunset. The wind whipped my face, and I felt every cell of my body fill with this strange silence that reigned here, at the very edge of the world. It was not just silence, it was the sound of emptiness, which no person, no living creature could fill. Only seabirds, albatrosses, mighty, endless in their flights, were the only evidence of life that continued to exist here, in this part of the planet where everything that had been before remained in the past. In the past that we all tried to forget, to leave, to hide from. I wasn't alone. Behind me stood others like me, who had come here looking for something that couldn't be found elsewhere. Not peace, not safety, but silence. I seemed to be the only one out of all this who had once tried to hold on to some piece of peace, some spark of hope. The others were lost to it. We were all lost, but unlike me, they weren't looking for an answer. They were simply trying to survive, to outlive this world that was crumbling, slowly but surely. Martin stood a little way off, looking up at the sky. His eyes were clouded, not so much from the sea breeze as from what was inside him. He didn't say much, and when he did, his voice was dry, almost indifferent. His naval jacket, faded from time and years in the empty spaces, was a reminder of another time. A time when there were still armies, war, and a struggle for something more than mere survival. Sami stood next to us, his eyes always sparkling, moving across the horizon faster than his body could follow. He was younger than all of us, still a child when the world began to collapse, but now he was quick, agile, full of the desire to act without thinking about the consequences. He had once been a courier in Buenos Aires, when there was still communication, electricity, and some life in the big cities. But now, when everything was switched off, he was one of those who moved faster than anyone else, running, escaping, not noticing that nothing was holding him back anymore. Eda Volkova, a doctor of microbiology, was the last of us to come here. She had always been strange, with an inner gaze that seemed to see more than the average person. She was not like us. She carried her scientific instruments and notes with her, even though these things now seemed useless. But she could not give them up. They were her link to the past, to what had been before the catastrophe. She believed that science was what could save us, what could explain what we had experienced. Nor, little was known about him. He appeared out of nowhere, and no one knew where he came from. He didn't share his past, didn't say where he was from or who he was, but there was something scary and alluring about it. He was the one who knew how to survive. He knew how to purify water with ashes and roots, how to make fire without leaving a smoke trail, how to move through the ruins of a city without leaving a trace. He was our guide, the one who knew what to do in the most difficult situations. I was the one who remembered how birds once flew, how the world was full of sounds and life. I was once a wildlife watcher, recording everything, writing it down, monitoring migrations and the state of populations. But now everything had changed. Now I stood with binoculars that had once been a precise instrument for research, but were now held together with tape, a reminder of a time when science could still make a difference. I wrote down my observations in a tattered notebook that no one read because there was no point anymore. But it was important to me. I was trying to understand what was happening around me. The birds were coming back. It was something strange, unusual. The albatrosses were soaring through the air as always, unconcerned about danger, but sometimes there was something different about their behavior, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I felt like they knew something. The birds, they were coming back, and I wrote it down, because maybe that was the answer. I often thought that here, at the edge of the world, we were just small parts in a huge machine that no longer existed. Everything we once knew was gone, and we were left trying to figure out what to do next. But despite all this, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world wasn't over, that even in this silence there was something more. Maybe this silence was exactly what we needed to find. Maybe this was the moment when we could try to drown out all the memories, all that we had lost, but I wasn't sure. We called ourselves the Drift, not because we were family, not because we supported each other. We were the remnants of what was left after everything was torn apart. We were the survivors, just remnants, drifting through an empty world. I kept watching the sea, the birds, the sun sinking below the horizon. We are here. We have survived. But what comes next? How will we move forward when even the simplest answers may only be traces of those who did not return? That night, when the parrot crashed into our window, I had almost forgotten what it was like to hear sounds. Not just the whisper of the wind or the sound of the waves, but real sounds that come from living things, from a world that still remembers how to sound in its chaos. I had almost weaned myself off this habit of listening. Our shelter was too quiet. Sometimes it seemed to me that the silence itself became a part of me, stuck to my ears, and I could no longer separate it from myself. I stopped thinking about what could be beyond these rocks, what could be in the world that had passed. But in that moment, everything changed. All I heard was the dull thud of the bird flying into the glass, and then its scream. No distortion, no weirdness, just a pure, piercing sound that pierced the silence. I froze, feeling my heart squeeze. It was unexpected, strange, and scary. The bird fell to the floor, thrashing helplessly, trying to fly again, but it was no use. Its bright green feathers were covered in dirt, blood dripping onto the frosted glass. Its eyes, frozen in some final thought, were filled with desperate determination. I couldn't understand what it was, but one thing was clear. This bird was not like the others. It was talking, and her words were clear. I remembered each word like an ominous whisper. TR-91C successful. Violation imminent. Protocol compromised. My gaze met Martin's, which were glazed over, and his face was clouded with an uncertain expression. He hadn't said much in a long time, but something shifted in him when he saw this. For a moment, I even thought he understood what I felt. But then I remembered again. We were all here at the edge of the world because we couldn't continue to live in the old way, no matter how it sounded. Sami, standing next to them, seemed puzzled, but not as much as Martin. His eyes were shining as always, ready to do something at once, although no one knew what. His eyes were always full of energy, even when the world around him seemed empty. Noor stood up and walked over to the parrot. He didn't hurry, didn't say a word, just took the body, lifted it gently, as if he understood that every gesture was important. We all froze, watching him bend down and examine the bird. "This is not just an accident," he said at last, his voice a whisper, but with a meaning hidden within it that I could not understand. "Someone taught this bird to talk," Martin said quietly, as if there was more to the words than just a fact. but everyone was silent. I couldn't find the words. We were all so far away from the world that had been before this, before all these changes, before we found ourselves here on this earth with a completely different perception of what was happening. Etta was silent too. She didn't pay any attention to the parrot. She just retreated into the corner, starting to take off her gloves and looking at us thoughtfully, as if everything that had happened was just another episode in a big story. For her, all these events were part of a riddle that she was trying to solve. And at that moment, I realized she knew more than we did. It wasn't just an oddity. It was part of something bigger. We all knew that this virus that had wiped out humanity wasn't just a disease. It was a weapon. It was a change in everything. It was a shadow of something we couldn't understand, but that somehow permeated every fabric of our existence. Etta always said that its manifestations changed with each passing year. It adapted. It mutated. We didn't know what to make of the parrot. We didn't know what to make of his words, which seemed to be part of something much more important. I couldn't forget them. TR-91C successful, breach imminent, protocol compromised. Those words pierced my mind like a knife, giving me no peace. Sami was the one who suggested a choice. He was always decisive, always faster than all of us. We could wait, we could study, research, but that didn't change the fact that time was running out. We couldn't afford to stop. Martin suggested we return to the city if there was anything left to find. He had always believed that answers could be found in those ruins. He believed that we were too far away from everything for everything to be lost, but his voice was unsure. Nor was silent. He was always silent, but that silence said more than words. His gaze on the parrot was as penetrating as ever. Then I realized that we had to choose. We had no other way. Finally, Etta offered an option. One vial, clear liquid, just like the old stories we heard. It was a vial marked TR-91C. Just one. Sami stepped forward and handed it to me. Not knowing what to do, I took the bottle. I couldn't understand why me. Why me? You believe, he said. You still believe, and that means you can survive. I couldn't refuse. I couldn't stop. The water inside me was already boiling, and I knew I had to drink it to find answers, to understand what was really going on. And so under this sky, among these crazy winds, I drank it. Several days passed after I drank the liquid. With each passing hour, everything became stranger, as if reality itself was losing its clear outlines. My view of the world changed. Everything I had once perceived as stable now seemed shaky and unfinished. I couldn't quite place what had happened inside me after I swallowed the vial. At first, I felt a slight dizziness, as if the world had suddenly contracted and expanded, and new lines had appeared in it that I hadn't noticed before. I looked at the ground, and instead of the usual stones and grass, I saw everything that was hidden in the shadows, everything that could not be perceived by ordinary eyes. I saw how roots were breaking through the earth, how leaves were moving. Although there was no wind, no sound, I heard how the earth was breathing. The birds, they were coming back. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. I could feel their presence in every movement of the air. In the days I'd spent on this coast, I'd counted 47 species, though not all of them were familiar to me. Some were so rare they hadn't been seen since 2036. Their return was more than just a cycle of nature. It was a sign. The silence between us began to grow thicker, almost palpable. We all felt it, that invisible gap between us that never healed. Martin continued to stare at the horizon, as he always did, but his eyes no longer searched for ships or drones. He did not believe that the world that was had ever existed. He believed that we were all already dead, but had not found the strength to admit it. It was hard for me to argue with him, because despite everything that was happening around us, I too felt that we lived between worlds. Etta was as absorbed in her science as ever. She continued to sort through the tubes, studying her notes, trying to find answers. I watched her as she moved her hands carefully, precisely, as if each of her movements were part of some vast, almost forgotten ritual. She was trying to understand what was happening to us, but I wasn't sure she wanted answers at all. Maybe she just needed something to anchor her to this world. Sami was different from the others. He was too young, too energetic to give up. He wore his memories like armor, always ready to move, to seek out something new. He searched among us for that moment when everything could still change. But I saw his eyes begin to dim. He saw what was happening to us too. We all saw the world we knew disappearing like fog with every step we took. And then that night, when I woke up with strange sensations, I understood. I understood that something was changing in my body. I could no longer tell where my mind ended and where something else began. I heard everything, even things that weren't supposed to be heard. Noises that seemed insignificant now made sense. I could perceive every movement of the wind, every sound sound that broke through the thickness of the fog, but I also felt the presence of something else. And that something was ominous. It was like a shadow that slowly creeps, hiding behind it everything we tried to leave in the past. I couldn't stay in the shadow for long. It was consuming us too slowly, and I knew that if we didn't change course, we too would disappear. We would become part of something that left no trace. But somewhere deep inside me, there was one question that was nagging at me. What if this wasn't a virus? What if this wasn't just a sick mutation, but something more? What if whoever released this virus knew it would lead to something that wasn't part of us? What if we weren't human anymore, but something else? What if those who survived became part of a new reality, and the only purpose of that reality was to survive, no matter what that meant for us as humans? I was walking along the coast trying to shake off these thoughts when I noticed that the parrot that had crashed into the window had disappeared. Its body had not been simply thrown away. It had disappeared. So had the entire scene. I stood there staring at the spot where it had fallen, trying to figure out what had really happened, but the answer never came. And then I realized, all these returns, all these signs, these birds, it was not just a return, it was a signal that we cannot ignore. And we started preparing. The sea, it was always there. Even when the sky was dark and the wind whistled like an inexorable threat, even when the cold crawled under our skin and made our bodies break, it stood before us unchanging and eternal as the land itself, and we looked at it, feeling its breath penetrate us. But it was not just a sea, it was an empty sea. Its calm, its waves, its seemingly endless expanse, all of it was dead. It boded no good. It promised no safety. It was there, like everything else around us, as pitiless as we were. I stood on the rock, looking out at the horizon. Martin sat a little way off, his face hidden under his hood. He always looked like he didn't want to be a part of the world around him, like his body was nothing more than a shell protecting his inner emptiness. We were all like that here. Empty, but with hope. Or maybe hope was a lie, like everything else. I don't know why I thought about it, standing there, but at some point I felt like I realized that there was nothing but this emptiness. I didn't know how much time had passed, but it was there. Everything around us seemed to disappear into this quiet, yet endless ocean. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't threatening, it was just empty, like everything we'd experienced. Sami, at this time, as always, was fussing around his backpack, sorting out something that at first glance did not matter. He was the one who was always the driving force, always looking for a solution, even if he understood that there was no solution, that all this was just a stupid wait for the end. Dr. Eda Volkova was there too. She was doing her research as always. It seemed to me that she didn't feel this emptiness. It was as if she was always busy with something important, whether it was writing in a notebook or sorting test tubes. It was her way of being, her way of staying afloat in this chaos. But she wasn't better than us. She was just better at hiding her fears. Nor, as always, stood to the side watching us. He never interfered, but always knew when to act. He was the one who could hide his thoughts behind words, but still do everything that was necessary, if only someone would let him. And I was there, trying to understand why we were still here and what had to happen before it all ended. Time seemed to have ceased to exist, but the memory of the past did not fade. I remembered how it all began, how the world suddenly became alien, how cities fell, how we, having lost touch with what once was, kept moving, not understanding where we were going. The world had been destroyed long ago. After the bloom, the virus that began to spread and consume everything, our life began in the remains, in the scattered parts that were once called civilization. Some said we would survive. Some hoped for a miracle, but nothing saved us, and here we were, at the edge of the world, searching for something we could not find. Several weeks passed, and the air that had once been so fresh it seemed almost alive was now polluted, settling in the lungs, leaving a taste of the past on the tongue. The sky was almost invisible behind the fog. Only the birds that occasionally returned reminded that there was still something in this world that could be called life. I looked up at the sky again, seeing a pair of albatrosses hovering in the misty air. It was like a memory coming back, like something we had forgotten, but that was still there, even if hidden. I knew they wouldn't be here for long, and even if they were, it wouldn't bring us any peace. That night, as we sat by the fire, I heard Martin say something quietly. It was his only word all day, and it was so out of keeping with his usual silence that I turned to look at him. "They will outlive us," he said. I didn't answer because I knew he was right. The birds would outlive us. Everything would outlive us. We were just things that had once been important, but were now just a memory of something that was gone. There was more life in their wings, in their flights, than in us. They were part of this world, and we probably weren't. Then it was quiet, very quiet. Sometimes I felt this darkness rolling over me, the weight of the past pressing on my consciousness again and again, as if it left me no choice, to be part of this emptiness or to disappear into it, to dissolve, like everything that came before us. I watched the fire crackle quietly and wondered what had happened to the world we had lost. We had become what we had become, aliens, and we tried to hide it, but in this emptiness, there was nothing to hide. The next day we moved on. All this time we had been walking along the coast, and although our steps had become mechanical, each movement felt like our last. We kept moving, hoping for something that never came. This was not a path, but an existence, a struggle to survive in a world that had long since ceased to consider us important. The people who walked beside me were nothing more than shadows of what had once been. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all somewhere halfway, between the past and the future. And perhaps the scariest thing was that we didn't know what exactly we were looking for. Were we looking for salvation, hope, or just a continuation of what had been, even if it was in the past? These questions didn't make sense because there was no answer to them. We stopped at a small cliff that looked like the edge of the earth. Martin, as always, was the first to reach the edge, his face hidden from me, but I knew he was not afraid. There was more shadow in his eyes than the others. I walked up to him, but I didn't say a word. Sometimes silence was louder than any words. Sami sat far away, lost in thought as always. He was young, but his views of the world often seemed ancient, as if there were years behind him that no one had seen. He was not ready to answer questions. He was ready to keep going. Sometimes I thought he just couldn't stop because that would mean death. Dr. Edda quietly rummaged through her backpack. We couldn't forget her coolness. She was a person of science, which meant that her belief in knowledge gave her strength. She was strong because she believed that everything had a meaning, that everything could be explained if only the right answers were found. But sometimes she looked as if she herself wasn't sure what she was looking for. Nor was the quietest, and perhaps the strangest. He always kept his distance, but there was something reassuring in his silence. He showed no fear. He simply did not allow himself to be a part of this world. And somehow we all understood that he was on the edge. He was a ray of light that illuminated our path, but he himself had long since lost his purpose. We walked on, and although everything around us looked the same, I felt something was changing. Maybe it was just a premonition, or maybe it was what was between us. We seemed to have forgotten what had happened before, but still felt a residual trace of what remained. We were all parts of what had once been one. In the evening, we sat by the fire again. The sky was dark as always, and there was a strange smell on the wind, the smell of salt and something else. We were all in different worlds, and each kept his own silence. And yet there was something in that silence, more than just unspeakable words. As I sat by the fire watching the flames reach into the sky, I felt something had changed in this place. Not the place itself, but something inside me. Each day I became more and more aware that we were not really moving away from something, but moving towards something. It was ironic because it was not a realization of freedom, but rather a realization that we were already too deep in it to go back. I raised my hands to the fire, feeling its warmth seep into me. It was different than before, not like the days when we thought it was just fire, the warmth we needed to survive. Now it seemed like it was more. It was a sign that we were closer than ever to what was to come. Martin was still sitting there, his eyes seeing nothing. He was in his own world, full of dark thoughts. His silence was not his usual one. It was the silence of a man who no longer believed in salvation. He didn't say a word, and I didn't expect it. Sami came up to me, but I didn't turn around. He was still full of that old childish enthusiasm that always made me feel like I could trust him. But even his bright eyes couldn't rid me of the feeling that time was running out. Edda sat a little to the side, lost in her thoughts. She had stopped writing things down, as she had before. She just sat and stared into the dark waters. Sometimes I thought she saw things that the others did not. She was a scientist. She had to find answers. But all she did was raise more questions. Nor moved away again. He was where no one could see him, but I knew what he was feeling. He was sensing something that was beyond our understanding. So we sat, the night falling, our fire dying. All that was left was shadow, fire, and the emptiness between us. We kept walking, knowing that one day our steps would lead us to an ending, but not knowing if that would be the end or just another chapter in something that no longer made sense. In the morning, we continued our journey, not because we wanted to, but because there was no other choice. We moved north in the direction where we hoped there was something that could stop us. We were no longer looking for salvation, no longer expecting miracles. We walked because every step, even if it did not lead to anything, was a step forward. And this somehow sharpened our senses. We knew that if we did not continue moving, we would simply remain in place, frozen in this world that had long forgotten what movement was. The winds were strong. They carried the cold from the ocean, which was as unchanging as our existence. The landscape around us remained empty, endless and cold, like our world, which was slowly fading. I could not tell that we were approaching anything that could bring us back to life. All these weeks we walked through these parched lands, and each new day was exactly the same as the one before. Time did not matter. It simply flowed like sand through your fingers. But that did not mean that we could just stop. Martin was silent, as always. But this time his silence was different. It was tense, as if he was trying to suppress something inside himself. I noticed that his eyes had become misty. He was increasingly looking into the void, not noticing anything around him. I tried to talk to him, but he did not answer. I did not know what was happening to him, but I was afraid. He was moving further and further away, as if something inside him was losing its shape. Sami, on the other hand, seemed more energetic than usual. He was always the one who remained optimistic, but now his demeanor was too bright, almost nervous. He talked about how we would soon find something that would give us an answer. He still believed that there was a chance somewhere, and it made me wonder, was I the one who had lost my faith, or simply did not want to see what was really happening to us? Dr. Edda continued sorting through her notes, ignoring us. There seemed to be no room for doubt in her eyes. She was like a machine that kept working without slowing down, as if her mind had been reprogrammed to do so. I watched her, but I couldn't tell what she was feeling. Perhaps she had already been prepared for what was to come. After all, she had always believed that there was an explanation for everything, and that even in the darkest corners of the world, there was light to be found. But what if her search was hopeless? Nor was always slightly behind us. His silence was not as deaf as Martin's. He did not distance himself. He was simply in another world. We were all close, but at some point I felt that each of us was far away. I did not even know what we were looking for. Maybe we were going to a place where there was nothing anymore, or, on the contrary, to something that could be the key to our future. But what was this future? And were we really alive? Night came quickly, and we stopped again. I couldn't understand why, but this time it was easier to sit by the fire. Maybe because I wasn't expecting anything anymore. Sitting silently, I felt the darkness swallow us up, as if we were part of it, and how the fire grew weaker with each passing hour. "We can't go on any longer," Martin said suddenly, and his voice was quiet, almost invisible. It was like a dying whisper. I turned to him. He was sitting cross-legged, staring into the fire. His face was as blank as everything else. "We have to keep going," I said, though I wasn't sure it was that important. We were going anyway. We were wasting time anyway. Martin sighed quietly. But for what? His question was not to me, but to everything that surrounded us. And I didn't know what to answer. There was no point in answering. We all knew there was no purpose. We were in this place without knowing why, without knowing what we were looking for. Nor stood up and walked away. He didn't say a word. I watched his silhouette disappear into the darkness. He often left like that, and I was no longer surprised. Sometimes it seemed to me that he was not part of our group. He was something bigger than us, something that was watching us from the side. He was mysterious, but there was something comforting about it. As we sat down again, I felt the tension in the air thicken. Time seemed to have been compressed to its limit. We were all on the edge, but each of us experienced it differently. I thought about the past, about what we had left behind, and about what would never return. We had become part of this world, but we could not change it. Maybe this was the end, or maybe it was just the beginning of a new path, a path we had come to after losing everything. But it didn't matter now. We continued to sit and watch the fire as it slowly died down. All that was left was silence. I woke up early. The light fog had not yet cleared, and the world around us was hidden behind a curtain of gray light. We had been moving for almost a week, and it seemed that each new step became heavier, as if the earth itself did not want to let us in. We did not speak much. Words were superfluous. We knew that not a single phrase could change our situation. Time remained elusive, independent of us, as if we had become a part of it. Martin continued to avoid eye contact. He was silent as always, but now his silence was not just heavy, it was heavy with doubt, as if he was always hiding something. Edda and Sami did not stop working. They did not look up from their tasks. Edda sorted her notes, and Sami continued to search for a solution. He said that there was a way somewhere, that we were close to the answer. But I began to doubt. Were we really close to the answer, or were we just living in hope that led us into emptiness? We continued walking through the deserted land, and with every step the world became more alien. I saw the sky seem lower and lower, and the earth became emptier. With each passing day, it became harder to believe that we would ever find what we were looking for. Had we simply lost touch with reality and our journey had become part of some crazy dream? And then, in one moment, it happened. Suddenly ahead, in the early morning light, we noticed a strange figure. It stood on the edge of a cliff, its silhouette standing out against the misty horizon. Someone was there. We froze, unable to understand who it was. We did not expect to meet someone in this deserted place. The flame of our fires was reflected in its figure, and it was cold like reality itself. We came closer. The figure stood motionless, and it was difficult to discern who it was. Perhaps it was one of the survivors we had given up hope of meeting, or perhaps it was just a mirage, another figment of our exhausted minds. But we came even closer, and then the figure turned. It was a man, old with long gray hair pulled back into a ponytail, his eyes pierced by some strange light, impossible to make out. He stood in absolute silence, as if he were part of this land. His gaze was fixed on the sky, as if he saw something we could not see. He did not move, did not try to speak. He was simply there, an element of this world inseparable from the earth, the wind and the horizon. We stopped, not knowing what to do. He was silent. We were silent. The silence was so thick that you could feel it on your skin. It seemed to me that time had stopped moving. I tried to speak, but the words were stuck in my throat. Our entire group froze, not knowing how to react to the appearance of this man. Martin was the first to break down and step forward. His face was dull, but there was a fire in his eyes, the fire of someone desperately searching for an answer to a question that torments them. The man didn't react. He continued to stare into the distance, as if we didn't exist. There was no fear in his gaze, no worry, only a deep awareness of something great and eternal. I stood there unsure of what to feel. We had walked all this way looking for an answer, but now I wasn't sure we were ready to hear it. I felt a chill envelop me, seeping into my very soul. I looked at Etta, who stood next to me, and saw her gaze growing more and more frozen. She was thinking about something, but was she ready to speak? "Who are you?" Sammy finally asked. He was the only one who dared to break the silence. His voice was trembling, but there was a firmness in it. The man did not answer right away. He continued to look into the distance. "I was one of those who stayed," he finally answered, his voice even and emotionless. "One of those who couldn't leave." "Leave?" Martin repeated as if he didn't quite understand. "Not everyone leaves," the man said. "Some stay, because they can't leave." These words rang like ancient truth. They made us all freeze because there was something frightening about them, something that did not fit into our understanding. We did not know what it was unknown to us. But these words, full of silent grief, became a powerful confirmation of what was happening to us. The man remained silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. In his eyes, I saw not what I could describe in words, but it was something ancient, immeasurably old, something that eluded us like a flickering shadow and was as unattainable as the light that eventually disappeared over the horizon. We stood there, caught in this world that no longer belonged to us, and there was no point in talking about what we thought. We were still looking for an answer, but perhaps there was none. We were part of this world that gave us no way out. The word was spoken, the answer was given. But was it not just a new beginning? Story 5. It had been a long time since the night had been so quiet. I sat by the window looking into the darkness, and everything around me seemed alive, but at the same time dead. This forest that surrounded my house was my home, but with each passing day, it became more and more unimaginable. The feeling of peace and security that I once felt when leaving the house gave way to anxiety. Strange things happen here at night. Sometimes when I close my eyes, it seems to me that even the walls are whispering, and every time I try to convince myself that it is just an illusion, that it is only the wind or animals. But for several weeks now, something has changed. I have always lived here alone. A small house on the edge of the woods, privacy, silence. It had its charm. All the neighbors were miles away, and I liked that. I could be myself without worrying about prying eyes, without feeling like part of something bigger. But ever since I discovered that this place hides something strange, I can't shake the feeling that I am not alone. At first, it was just a strange feeling I got when I entered the dark corners of the house. Then things started happening that defy explanation. One night I was sitting by the fire, warming myself after a long day of work in the woods. I was not under the influence of alcohol or any substance, but I felt my gaze increasingly focused on one spot in the corner of the room where there was a shadow, vague and constantly changing. I tried to look away, but I was drawn back. It was strange to me, but at the same time I could not believe that this was something supernatural. I was a practical person, not inclined to believe in such things. But the shadow did not leave me. I stood up several times, came closer, and turned on the light, but nothing, only an empty room. I convinced myself again and again that it was just a figment of my imagination. Perhaps the faint light from the fireplace was creating an illusion. I tried to brush this feeling aside, but it kept coming back. I slept badly. I woke up at night feeling like something unknown was bothering me. One night when I opened my eyes, it seemed to me that someone was standing at the head of my bed. I froze, my breathing became heavy, but it was probably just a dream. Or was it? Maybe I was just imagining something again? Several days passed and I felt the presence of something invisible more and more. Sometimes when I passed through a room, I noticed something flickering in the corner of my eye. Just one glance, and again emptiness. It was not an ordinary shadow, but something alive, changing shape. It always seemed to follow me, but at a distance. I tried to relax, got out of the house, spent a few hours in the forest to clear my head, but nothing helped. The fear grew. On the fourth day, I found myself again in front of the very corner where it all began. And then, I think I noticed movement. Not in the room, but near the house. I slowly approached the window, pulling the curtains down a little lower. There was no trace in sight, but something was wrong with this place. The sky seemed cloudy, and there was a strange silence all around. Only the wind occasionally interrupted this ominous calm. My head couldn't figure out what was happening anymore. I tried to find an explanation, but to no avail. Just when I thought it was all just a figment of my imagination, my dog, Harley, started acting strange. She no longer ran around the house, barked at people and animals passing by. Now she just sat by the door, as if she was waiting for something. There was fear in her eyes. I noticed that sometimes she looked at the dark corner of the room where I so carefully avoided looking. The days dragged on. Sometimes I tried to overcome my growing anxiety, but it was impossible. I felt the atmosphere in the house changing, and the night brought more and more strange sounds. Strange like rustling, echoes of footsteps, and some invisible movements. Sometimes it seemed to me that someone was walking around the house, and I could even hear breathing. But when I got up to check, no one was there. And then one night, when I was about to give up, I saw it, a shadow. It started crawling along the walls like liquid, changing and writhing. I thought I was going crazy again, but then I realized I couldn't turn around. I froze. Something was there, and it was coming for me. I sat in the darkness, unable to move. This shadow was not just a shadow. It moved as if it had a mind of its own, adapting to the space and distorting the reality around it. I felt the cold wrap around my fingers, the air in the room growing heavy, as if something invisible was squeezing me in its grip. I stood up, but my legs seemed to be unresponsive. Every movement was like moving through a viscous liquid, and I couldn't stop staring at this strange silhouette that was crawling along the walls, leaving behind barely noticeable but distinct traces. I tried to take a step, but I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the air was too thick, as if I was trapped. No matter how hard I tried to move, my thoughts were jumbled, and the sensations were so strong that I could barely focus. Everything that was happening seemed terribly real, but I couldn't understand what it was. I stared at the dark corner of the room where this substance was hiding. It began to change shape, stretching and contracting, and I clearly felt something inside me tighten, as if I was part of this unimaginable movement. I reached for the phone to call for help, but my hands refused to obey me again. My fingers just clenched, unable to find the necessary impulse to press the button. This feeling of helplessness overwhelmed me while I was trying to at least do something. I closed my eyes, but when I opened them again, the shadow was already standing in front of me. Its shape was not human. It had no clear contours, but I could still make out a face. Not a real face, of course, but something that resembled a human one, but blurred and disfigured, like a reflection in water over which many waves had passed. And this face began to approach me. There was no pain, no fear in the sense that I had known those feelings before. It was more like an eclipse, when you feel like you are losing yourself, like you are disappearing. I knew that if I didn't do something now, I would be stuck in this place forever. But what could I do? I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my throat. It was the same as with my legs, like something was preventing me from doing normal human things. The shadow seemed to sense my struggle. It didn't move faster or slower. It stayed the same, but I could feel it growing stronger, as if it was feeding on my terror. I couldn't contain it. It began to spill out, taking over my thoughts. Every movement, every breath became heavy, as if the air itself was filled with this essence. And then, when I was ready to give in, When everything inside me was screaming at me not to give in, I felt a cold hand touch my cheek. It was a real touch, although I knew I couldn't feel anything from that shadow. I jerked back sharply, and I think that was the moment when I finally felt my freedom. I took a step, then another. My body revived me, as if I had woken up from a long sleep. I didn't know what happened next. I ran through the house without stopping. Only thoughts pounded in my head. Don't stop! Don't look back! But when I reached the door, I turned around again. There was no shadow or anyone else in the room. It was empty. The walls were as before, and the light in the hallway was dim, creating no fear. It was like a dream, but so vivid and desperate that I couldn't believe that it was just a figment of my imagination. I stood at the door, barely catching my breath, not daring to go out. My body was terrified, but my mind was trying to find an explanation. I checked the room, looked at every corner. Everything was as usual. No shadow, no sounds, only the silence of the night, which filled the house again. But I knew one thing. What I had just experienced was not normal. I tried to calm down, but the realization that this house had become alien, that it held something that could be much more terrible than I could have imagined, did not leave me. Since then, every time I enter a dark room, I feel its presence. It is not always obvious, but I feel it watching me, as if I am not the only one in this house. And although I cannot see anything, I know that it is near. When I returned home, the feeling of not being alone did not leave me. I tried to forget the moment when the shadow moved along the walls, tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, a hallucination from fatigue or stress. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this experience was too real to be just a fantasy. I sat in my chair, trying to calm down and return to normal life. It was difficult. Every movement, every sound seemed suspicious to me, and even the silence in the room was now filled with an invisible tension. I turned on the lights in every room, checked the windows and doors, even looked in the closets and under the bed, but none of this brought relief. I still felt the presence of something that was nearby. It felt like the house was alive, and there was something dark hiding in it. I remembered how I felt on edge that day. At first, it was just a shadow thing, but now it was more than that. I started noticing that something was different in the house. For example, the doors started creaking for no apparent reason, and there were marks on the floors that I couldn't have made myself. It was hard to explain. Marks like something heavy was moving around my house, but I couldn't imagine what could have done it. I was alone, and it seemed like no one else could be here. One night when I woke up, I thought I heard a quiet rustling sound. It was a strange sound, like someone was slowly moving furniture or moving something heavy around the room. I froze in the darkness, listening. My heart was pounding loudly, and a cold horror appeared in my chest. I tried to get up, but again I felt my body refuse to obey. My legs were as if paralyzed, and I could neither move nor scream. I could only lie there, clutching the blanket, waiting for what would happen. Suddenly the sound stopped. I lay in complete silence, but the tension was so strong that I felt it filling the room. I knew I couldn't go on living like this. At night, I seemed to hear footsteps that couldn't be mine. But what was it? Who could be in the house besides me? I decided I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for this thing, this shadow, to show up again. I started exploring the house. I remembered the old utility room that had been locked for a long time. I had never looked into it. It was always out of the way. I thought maybe that was where the answer I was missing was hidden. The utility room was in the backyard, right behind the house, and I still couldn't figure out why it was there. Maybe someone had once used it as a storage room or a workshop, but now it seemed abandoned and locked. I felt my hands shaking as I touched the door handle. It didn't budge, and it took me a few tries to open it. It was dark inside, and there was a strange smell in the air. I turned on the flashlight and pointed the light deeper. My blood ran cold when I saw that there was an old, dusty box lying in the corner. It was closed, but it had clearly not been opened for a long time. I walked over to it, my mind spinning with thoughts of what I might find. Maybe some old things, documents, or maybe it was just an old box left over from the previous owners of the house. But when I opened the box, what I saw was not what I expected. There were things in there that shouldn't have been there. Several dark old notes. No idea why they were in this back room. I reached out and picked one up. It was covered in dust and looked like something long forgotten, maybe even ancient. The note was written on old parchment, and the writing on it was strange, as if someone had written it in someone else's handwriting. I couldn't make out all the words, but a few phrases were clear. You are alone, but you will not be alone when the shadow comes. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Shadow. What does it mean? Why is it written in such a strange manner? Who could have left such a note here? That moment was a turning point. I realized that my life would never be the same. I was on the brink of something I couldn't control, and the more I tried to understand, the more I realized that none of this was an accident. The house wasn't just a place to live. It held something more, something dark that had come here long ago and now wouldn't let go. Now I knew one thing. I couldn't escape from it. When I returned home, the feeling of not being alone did not leave me. I tried to forget the moment when the shadow moved along the walls, tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, a hallucination from fatigue or stress. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this experience was too real to be just a fantasy. I sat in my chair, trying to calm down and return to normal life. It was difficult. Every movement, every sound seemed suspicious to me, and even the silence in the room was now filled with an invisible tension. I turned on the lights in every room, checked the windows and doors, even looked in the closets and under the bed. But none of this brought relief. I still felt the presence of something that was nearby. It felt like the house was alive, and there was something dark hiding in it. I remembered how I felt on edge that day. At first it was just a shadow thing, but now it was more than that. I started noticing that something was different in the house. For example, the doors started creaking for no apparent reason, and there were marks on the floors that I couldn't have made myself. It was hard to explain. Marks like something heavy was moving around my house, but I couldn't imagine what could have done it. I was alone, and it seemed like no one else could be here. One night when I woke up, I thought I heard a quiet rustling sound. It was a strange sound, like someone was slowly moving furniture or moving something heavy around the room. I froze in the darkness, listening. My heart was pounding loudly and a cold horror appeared in my chest. I tried to get up, but again I felt my body refuse to obey. My legs were as if paralyzed and I could neither move nor scream. I could only lie there, clutching the blanket, waiting for what would happen. Suddenly the sound stopped. I lay in complete silence, but the tension was so strong that I felt it filling the room. I knew I couldn't go on living like this. At night I seemed to hear footsteps that couldn't be mine. But what was it? Who could be in the house besides me? I decided I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for this thing, this shadow, to show up again. I started exploring the house. I remembered the old utility room that had been locked for a long time. I had never looked into it. It was always out of the way. I thought maybe that was where the answer I was missing was hidden. The utility room was in the backyard, right behind the house, and I still couldn't figure out why it was there. Maybe someone had once used it as a storage room or a workshop, but now it seemed abandoned and locked. I felt my hand shaking as I touched the door handle. It didn't budge, and it took me a few tries to open it. It was dark inside, and there was a strange smell in the air. I turned on the flashlight and pointed the light deeper. My blood ran cold when I saw that there was an old dusty box lying in the corner. It was closed, but it had clearly not been opened for a long time. I walked over to it, my mind spinning with thoughts of what I might find. Maybe some old things, documents, or maybe it was just an old box left over from the previous owners of the house. But when I opened the box, what I saw was not what I expected. There were things in there that shouldn't have been there. Several dark, old notes. No idea why they were in this back room. I reached out and picked one up. It was covered in dust and looked like something long forgotten, maybe even ancient. The note was written on old parchment, and the writing on it was strange, as if someone had written it in someone else's handwriting. I couldn't make out all the words, but a few phrases were clear. You are alone, but you will not be alone when the shadow comes. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Shadow. What does it mean? Why is it written in such a strange manner? Who could have left such a note here? That moment was a turning point. I realized that my life would never be the same. I was on the brink of something I couldn't control. And the more I tried to understand, the more I realized that none of this was an accident. The house wasn't just a place to live. It held something more, something dark that had come here long ago and now wouldn't let go. Now I knew one thing. I couldn't escape from it. I woke up with a feeling of heaviness in my chest, as if someone was sitting on me and I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something invisible and overwhelming that penetrated the very fabric of my existence. My eyes opened in darkness, and I couldn't immediately figure out where I was. Everything around me was shrouded in darkness, but there was a strange, unnatural light coming from somewhere in the corner. I tried to move, but my body didn't obey, as if it were alien, cold, and heavy. I knew I should get up, but I couldn't. Fear gripped my entire body, and I felt it spreading like a wave, flooding me from within. Suddenly, my gaze caught on something strange. On the floor, right by the door, I noticed footprints, deep, as if someone had walked here, leaving heavy, distinct imprints. These footprints were dark, almost black, and they led deeper into the room. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. Something inside me resisted. I knew I shouldn't go there, but curiosity or some inner impulse made me get up and go to that spot. I took a step and suddenly heard a rustling sound, barely audible, but distinct. It came from the opposite wall, as if something was moving where there shouldn't be movement. My hands were shaking, and I could barely hold the flashlight as I approached the tracks. With each step I took, it became harder and harder to breathe, and the darkness around me seemed to thicken, becoming thicker and more viscous. This place, this space, it began to press as if it were alive and waiting for something from me. I walked up to the tracks and noticed that they not only led deeper into the room, but also ended at a wall. It was strange because the wall was completely empty. I walked closer, examining it. At first glance, it was just part of an ordinary room, but the more I looked at it, the more it felt like it was not quite a wall. Suddenly, I felt something cold touch my neck, and I flinched in horror. It was almost invisible, but there, like a slight cold wind coming through cracks and crevices that weren't there. I turned around sharply but saw nothing. The room remained deathly silent, and I felt the cold envelop my body again. The silence was oppressive, and this sense of presence became so strong that I could no longer ignore it. I stepped back, but as soon as I turned to go back into the room, I noticed another detail. On the ceiling, in the dim light of the flashlight, a trail of what looked like drops appeared. It was small, but these drops seemed to be falling from the ceiling, as if someone or something was leaving them. I couldn't figure out where they came from, because the ceiling was dry and clean. With each passing moment, it all became more absurd and at the same time more real. I couldn't understand what was happening. Everything in this house became alien, and every movement, every change in the atmosphere was like a signal that I was not where I should be. This was not normal. This was not just my imagination. I knew it was something else. I tried to go back to my room again, but before I could reach the door, something stopped me. My gaze fell to the floor. There, among the footprints, was actually something else. It was not just a dark spot. It was the imprint of something larger. The shadows were too sharp, too defined, to be a simple play of light and dark, and in the very center of that spot, I could make out a shape that resembled a human hand. I stood there, completely still, my heart pounding in my chest. I had trouble breathing and I felt panic rising. What was this? Part of me knew I shouldn't be here, that if I stayed, this would only get worse. But I couldn't pull away. I couldn't move, even though I knew I was on the edge. I tried to bring myself back to reality. I raised my eyes and looked at the wall, but now its surface was strangely changed. Lines appeared on it, thin, unnatural, as if someone had drawn them on its surface without leaving a trace. These lines moved as if by themselves. My eyes followed them, and I could not understand what they meant, but they continued to grow, stretching, forming shapes that I could not recognize. Then I realized I wasn't in my home. I was in another place, another time, or even another world. This house was just a shell, and I was part of something much darker and older. It was the beginning, but the beginning of what? What awaited me if I continued down this path? I didn't know, but I knew one thing. If I stayed, I would follow this to the very end, and perhaps the end was already near. I didn't know what had happened since I'd walked into that room, but the world around me had slowly become blurry, as if all things were losing their clarity. I felt my thoughts starting to get lost, as if they too were beginning to dissolve in that strange, oppressive air. Trying to find some sense of control, I pressed myself against the wall. My body was tense and my mind was in chaos. The shadows around me kept moving, and I knew that if I stayed here any longer, I would lose myself. I had to leave. I tried to find a way out, but the walls seemed so high, as if they were narrowing, squeezing the space. Suddenly, I heard a sound, barely audible, like the rustle of wind or the rustling of fabric, something unnatural and close. It came from the corner where I had seen those same tracks leading into the room. Something I could not see seemed to be moving there, hidden in the darkness. I sighed, trying to calm my shaking hands. Fear filled me, but I knew I couldn't stay in this place. I took a few steps back, hoping to find the door, but when I turned around, it was gone. I froze, my heart pounding. Where was it? I knew for sure the door was here, but it seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. I stepped in the direction where it should have been, but there was only emptiness, surrounded by a slithering shadow. No matter how hard I tried to gather my thoughts, they eluded me. The walls became more and more bizarre, and the space around me seemed to expand and contract at the same time. I felt the ground beneath my feet become soft, as if it had ceased to be solid and was beginning to swallow me. I stopped. Everything was quiet. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a rustling sound, which came again from that very corner. I realized that it was not just a sound. It was some kind of whisper, not a human, not an audible voice, but barely perceptible, as if someone was trying to convey information to me. I could not make out the words, but everything in this whisper resembled a warning, some kind of inevitable sentence. I turned and looked again at the place where the footprints had come from, but now they looked different. They were spreading, as if these prints were not just footprints, but alive. They were moving, filling the room, forming complex patterns, and in each of these footprints, I saw something familiar, something frightening, as if they were images connected to my own experiences. I stepped forward without realizing what I was doing. Every movement was unconscious, and I could no longer control my hand as it reached for those marks. When I touched one of those lines, it immediately began to pulse, as if the room itself was responding to my presence. The wall, which had just seemed normal, began to vibrate, and a strange smell appeared in the air, a mixture of mold and something unnatural. At that moment, I felt something moving under my feet. The ground beneath me began to shift, and the walls began to move. I instinctively wanted to jump back, but the sensation was so strong that I could not find my balance. At that moment, a dark figure appeared in front of me, barely visible in this space. It was like a shadow, but it did not move, only stood, watching me. I couldn't figure out who or what it was. She was too far away, but so close at the same time that I felt her presence on every level of my perception. It was something alien, something that couldn't be part of this world, but was part of me. The feeling was familiar, but I couldn't place it. Suddenly, the lights in the room went out, and I was in complete darkness again. But this darkness was different. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was alive. It was squeezing me, as if it was consuming my body and mind on its own. I felt something cold and heavy touch my arm, and then a cold shudder ran down my spine. It felt like I wasn't alone, and that something was watching me. I realized that I couldn't be here anymore. I had to run. I had to get out, but everything around me had become alien, twisted in its own labyrinth. I tried to find the door, but every step led me further into the void until I found myself in the very center of this dark shadow. I don't know how long I stood in this dark space. Time here lost all meaning, and everything seemed to be slowed down and sped up at the same time. I felt my body gradually losing contact with reality. Even breathing became difficult, as if the air around me had become heavy, viscous, not allowing me to breathe. My footsteps no longer sounded. The silence was unusual, unnatural. Nothing disturbed it. No sounds, no signs of life. The only landmarks were those incomprehensible traces, which now became more and more distinct. They filled the space, spreading in different directions, their lines intertwined, forming something similar to ancient runes. These signs caused me a feeling of anxiety, but I could not tear my eyes away from them. For some reason, I was sure that they were leading me somewhere, although I did not know where. The walls continued to change shape. They warped and twisted, as if the space around me was alive and subject to some invisible influence. I no longer felt the ground beneath my feet, although at some point it didn't matter. I couldn't find my place, couldn't understand where I was or what was happening. Then I felt something change. At that moment, in the very heart of the silence, the air in front of me began to tremble. It was like a slight tingling that became more and more noticeable. At first, I didn't understand what it was, but gradually the sensation became more and more distinct. There was a certain force in the air, almost physical, pulling me along. I felt this invisible energy beginning to influence me, as if I were not just a part of this space, but a participant in it, drawn toward some unknown goal. I tried to take a step back, but my legs refused to obey me. I couldn't tear myself away from the place where I stood, and at that moment, I saw how the dark footprints began to move. They didn't just stay in place, they slowly but surely crawled towards me, forming a circle around me. I felt myself shrinking in this ring, how it swallowed me more and more, leaving me no room to maneuver. I was trapped, unable to move, only feeling how the darkness thickened around me. Still, I couldn't stop myself from watching this process. What was happening was beyond logic. The traces that seemed ordinary became alive, as if they could breathe. They reached out to me, surrounding me. I felt them penetrating me, as if they were a part of me, a part of my consciousness, filling it and absorbing it. And then, when everything seemed almost finished, when there was no longer any strength or opportunity to fight this evil, I felt one of the lines of these traces touch my face. It was cold and cruel. It seemed that at that moment I began to dissolve, becoming a part of what surrounded me. Everything around me disappeared into a dark void, and I disappeared. I don't know how much time passed. I regained consciousness, but I was no longer sure that I was alive. Everything around me seemed as untamed and alien as before. I tried to move, but my body did not respond. It was as if I was not in my body, as if it had become part of this emptiness, this invisible force. And so, in this misunderstanding, in this abyss, I felt movement again. I was no longer alone. Something was moving nearby, something unknown, something that should not have been here, but now was nearby, perceptible and incomprehensible.